I always believed that the people who shared my blood could never hurt me, but that belief shattered the night I discovered the truth hiding inside my own home. It began with a feeling subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. My room wasn't the same. Things were moved. The air felt disturbed, like someone had been standing there only moments before I walked in. So I did something I never imagined I'd do. I pretended to travel with friends. Smiles, suitcase, the whole performance, while secretly hiding just a few houses away, watching my own family from a distance. That's when my elderly neighbor, Mr. Harlan, walked up behind me, gently squeezing my shoulder. His voice trembled when he whispered, "Wait until midnight. You'll see everything." And at the stroke of 12, I did. What I witnessed inside my childhood home didn't just freeze my blood, it rewrote everything I thought I knew about my parents and my sister. Their secrets were darker than greed, deeper than betrayal, and far more personal than I was prepared for. But here's the part you must hear, because the truth didn't just break my heart. It lit a fire inside me. If you stay with me to the end, you'll learn exactly how far a daughter can go when her own family crosses a line that can never be uncrossed. And how one night of secrets turned into the most shocking revenge they never saw coming. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. And it all begins at midnight. My name is Claire Matthews. I'm 38 years old, a senior paralegal who has spent most of her adult life believing that logic can solve anything. I grew up in a quiet New England town, and after my mother passed away 3 years ago, I returned to the house she left me, a place filled with memories, sunlight, and the kind of silence that makes you feel safe. Or at least it used to. Lately, that silence has begun to feel different. Heavy, watchful, like it's holding its breath. It started so subtly I almost brushed it off. A glass I'd left on the right side of the counter would be sitting on the left when I came home from work. The curtains in my bedroom, always pulled shut before I left, would be open half an inch as though someone had been peeking out. Even the smell of the house was off. My mother always kept the place scented with lavender and wood polish, but now, every so often, I'd catch a faint trace of something darker, warmer, like burned wood mixed with old incense. Not constant, not overwhelming, just enough to raise the tiny hairs on my arms. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I moved the glass and forgot. Maybe I didn't pull the curtains closed all the way. Maybe the scent was drifting in from outside. People in their late 30s start forgetting little things all the time, right? At least that's what I told myself as I forced my heartbeat to slow and tried to file these oddities under harmless coincidence. But coincidences don't happen every single day. After 2 weeks of these quiet disruptions, the unease in my chest grew into something sharper. Fear is a strange creature. It doesn't roar at first. It whispers. It nudges. It waits for you to admit you're listening. And I was listening even if I didn't want to. The real trouble began at night. Several times that week, I jolted awake with the same sensation, a sudden, violent awareness that someone was standing right beside my bed, not touching me, not moving, just being there, watching. The feeling was so strong that the moment my eyes snapped open, my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I would lie there frozen, straining to hear footsteps, breathing anything that might confirm the presence I felt in my bones. But there was nothing. No sound of retreating steps. No creak of the door, no shifting shadows, just darkness, and the unnerving certainty that I had missed something by a fraction of a second. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was stress. The firm had been busy lately. Maybe it was loneliness. Living alone after caring for my mother had its own kind of ache. But I've always had a strong intuition, a trait my mother used to call our family's strange little gift. She trusted it. And I had learned over the years that whenever I dismissed it, I paid for it later. Something was wrong in my house, and something or someone was in my room. I started taking precautions. Logical steps, the kind you take when you don't want to feel like you're losing your mind. I took photos of the way objects were positioned before I left for work. I placed tiny slips of paper in the bedroom doorframe, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look, and checked if they had fallen by the time I returned home. One evening, I even took the drastic step of changing the locks. A full new set. Top quality. None of it made a difference. The objects kept shifting, the curtains kept opening. The faint smell lingered in unpredictable waves as if carried by someone's clothing. And the paper slip stayed exactly where I had left it, completely undisturbed, which meant whoever was entering my room didn't need the door. The thought lodged itself deep in my mind like a splinter. There had to be another explanation, some trick of air pressure, some structural quirk, something. But every possibility I could come up with fell apart under the weight of common sense. Houses don't open their own curtains. They don't move furniture. They don't breathe down your neck in the middle of the night. The worst part wasn't the fear of an intruder. It was the feeling that whoever or whatever it was testing me, observing me, trying to see how much I noticed, how much I could tolerate. By the end of that second week, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom anymore. The idea of lying vulnerable in the dark in that space where the air felt wrong, no, I couldn't do it. So I moved to the living room thinking the open space and the steady glow of the streetlight through the window would make me feel safe. For a while, it worked. I curled up on the couch with a blanket pulled to my chin, listening to the refrigerator hum and the wind rattle the old maple tree outside. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but sleep eventually pulled me under. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me. A sharp, unmistakable scrape, the sound of wood dragging against wood. My eyes flew open. The room was dim, only the soft orange streetlight spilling across the floor. For several seconds I held my breath, wondering if I had dreamed it. But then it came again, louder this time. A chair, being dragged across the floor, from inside my bedroom where no one should have been, where no one could have been. My blood ran cold and the blanket slipped from my hands as I sat upright, trembling, listening, every muscle locked. Something was happening behind that closed door, and I wasn't ready for what I was about to discover next. I sat frozen on the couch long after the scraping sound stopped, my breath shallow, my mind racing through explanations I didn't believe. Eventually, morning crept in through the thin curtains, and with daylight came the courage to open my bedroom door. The chair was exactly where I had left it. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked wrong. And that, more than anything, terrified me. Because something had happened. I knew it. I felt it. The room still carried that faint, unsettling scent like scorched wood and incense clinging to the air. But without proof, I could do nothing except move through the day with nerves stretched tight as thread. I told myself I'd figure it out. I always did. I just didn't expect my past to walk up my front steps before I even had the chance. It was early afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and after the last few days, even the sound of the chime made my pulse spike. When I opened the door, the last people I wanted to see were standing on my porch, my parents Stephen and Lorna Matthews and my younger sister Julia trailing behind them with her arms crossed and a painted-on smile. I don't know which shocked me more, their presence or the fact that they were smiling wide as if we were all one big happy family. "Claire, sweetheart," my mother exclaimed, stepping forward so quickly she nearly stumbled over the welcome mat. She wrapped me in a hug that felt tight, practiced, and completely foreign. My father followed, clasping my shoulders with both hands. "You look tired," he murmured. "Have you been sleeping?" Sleeping. I had barely slept at all, but that wasn't something I intended to tell any of them. I pulled back slightly and forced a steady tone. "What are you all doing here? You didn't call." "We were in the area," Julia chimed in, brushing past me into the house before I could invite her. "Thought we'd check on you." "Check on me?" That was rich. We hadn't had a real conversation in almost 4 years. My relationship with my parents had always been formal, distant, the kind that looked normal on the surface, but never felt warm underneath. They weren't cruel people, just emotionally absent. And Julia. Well, Julia was the storm that followed me for most of my youth. Jealous, dramatic, constantly in competition, even when no one was competing with her. And now, here they were standing in my living room looking around like inspectors taking inventory. "We've been talking." My mother began clasping her hands in that nervous habit she'd developed later in life. "And we realized we haven't been present enough. Family should be family." I gave a short laugh before I could stop myself. After 4 years, my father ignored the question, settling instead into the armchair as if it belonged to him. "How have you been sleeping?" he asked again. "Any disturbances?" "Nightmares." I stiffened. "Why are you asking me that?" He offered a shrug, meant to look casual but failed. "You've always been sensitive. We just want to make sure you're all right, living alone in such a big place." Stress can play tricks on the mind. There it was. Subtle, but unmistakable. They weren't here for emotional reconnection. They were here with something rehearsed, something specific. Their sudden concern felt unnatural, too. Pointed. My parents had never once asked about my sleep patterns, not even when I was a child suffering night terrors. I watched Julia wander through the house, her eyes trailing slowly over the furniture, the hardwood floors, the hallway that led to the guest rooms. She paused at every window, every corner, every detail. Not admiring, calculating. "This place is gorgeous," she said over her shoulder. "Do you know how much property values have jumped in this neighborhood? You could easily get double what Mom paid." "It's not for sale," I replied. Julia smiled all teeth. "I know. But it's fun to think about, long term." My pulse kicked. Long term. Coming from her, it sounded less like a hypothetical and more like a plan she'd already drafted. "What's really going on?" I asked, my voice firmer now. My mother sighed dramatically as though my suspicion wounded her. "Can't we simply visit families do that?" "Not ours," I wanted to say. Instead, I folded my arms and waited. If I'd learned anything growing up in this family, it was that silence made them nervous. Sure enough, my father cleared his throat after a few beats. "Actually," he began, "we were thinking, since you're here alone and working long hours, maybe it would be wise to give us a spare key, just in case something happens." There it was, the real reason. The warmth, the sudden curiosity about my routines, the probing questions about sleep. It was all leading to this. Access. Control. "No," I said plainly. "Absolutely not." My mother blinked, startled by the firmness in my tone. "Claire, we're only thinking about your safety." Julia wandered back into the living room with her arms folded. "Yeah, you never know what could happen when you live alone. Break-ins, health issues. Someone should be able to check on you." "I can take care of myself," I said. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a micro-expression, but I caught it. The quick flash of irritation. Calculation. Julia exchanged a glance with them, a silent conversation passing among the three of them, one I wasn't included in. My stomach turned. They stayed for another hour walking the house, asking relentless questions about my schedule, my nightly habits, the security system I used. My mother even asked what time I typically went to bed. That was when I realized they weren't looking for my well-being. They were looking for my vulnerabilities. When they finally left, each hugged me tightly, too tightly. On the doorstep, my father said, "Think about the key, Claire. It's for the best." I shut the door behind them and leaned against it, exhaling hard. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Their presence lingered like fog. I replayed every comment, every glance, every unusual question. Why now? Why all at once? And why keys? As night settled over the house, I forced myself through a routine that felt increasingly fragile. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. I pulled the curtains tight. I sat on the couch listening to the quiet hum of the house as if it were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was late when I went to the front door one last time, driven by a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. I flicked on the porch light and crouched to inspect the lock. That's when I saw it. Fresh scratches, thin but unmistakable, circling the area around the keyhole. Someone had tried to pick the lock. Not days ago, not weeks. Today, right after my family left. A cold wave rolled through me, stronger than anything I had felt so far. Because whoever had done this hadn't been testing the house. They had been testing me. And I knew with absolute clarity that this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep at all after discovering those scratch marks. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at the front door as if it might open on its own. Every few minutes my eyes drifted back to the lock, replaying the image in my mind, those thin, deliberate marks carved into the metal. Someone had tried to get in. Someone who didn't expect me to be home. Someone who wasn't surprised when I refused to hand over a spare key because they already had a plan to get one another way. By the time morning arrived, my nerves were stretched so tight they felt brittle. I moved through the motions of getting ready for work, but nothing felt normal. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that weren't there, watching the shadows in the hallway like they might move. When I stepped outside onto my porch, the sunlight felt harsh instead of comforting. I must have looked as frayed as I felt, because the moment I closed the door behind me, I heard a voice call out, "Claire, honey, are you all right?" I turned to see Mary Keating, my next-door neighbor, standing on her steps in her pale blue sweater. 71 years old, sharp-eyed and steady as bedrock. She wasn't one for gossip or dramatics. If anything, she was the type who believed in minding her business unless something was truly wrong. And the look she gave me wasn't curiosity, it was concern. I tried to straighten myself, offering what I hoped passed for a normal smile. "Morning, Mary." "I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well." She didn't buy it for a second. Her eyes narrowed behind her glasses. "Come here a moment." Before I could protest, she was already walking toward me. When she reached my porch, she took my hand lightly, warm, firm, comforting. "You look scared," she said softly. "And I think I know why." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "Come inside," she said. "I don't want to talk out here." That alone was enough to twist my stomach. Mary wasn't a fearful woman, not by nature. If she thought this conversation needed walls around it, something truly was wrong. I followed her into her home, the familiar scent of old books and fresh coffee wrapping around me like an embrace. She shut the door, locked it, then guided me into her kitchen. Once we were seated, she didn't waste time. "Claire," she began gently, "I've seen people going into your house when you're not there." I blinked, stunned into silence. "What do you mean, when for the past couple of weeks?" she said. "Middle of the day, usually between 1 and 3. Always when your car's gone." My heart started pounding. "Mary, are you sure they were going into my house?" She lifted her chin, offended by the implication that her eyesight or her mind could be doubted. "I've lived next door to this house for 28 years. I know your porch, I know your door, and I know the sound it makes when it closes." I swallowed hard. What did these people look like? She hesitated. Different ones, not the same group. But they moved with purpose. They walked in like they belonged there, like they had every right. "Did they break in?" I asked. "No." Her voice was a soft but firm whisper. "They used keys." A chill shot through me so fast it made me dizzy. Keys. Keys. The word looped in my mind until it nearly echoed. My family had asked for spare keys. Then scratch marks appeared on the lock, and now strangers were entering with keys I never gave out. Mary watched me carefully. "Claire, honey, do you know anything about this? Are you renting a room? Letting someone stay because I assumed you were at first. But after seeing your face this morning, I don't think that's the case. It's not," I said, shaking my head, feeling faint. "I haven't let anyone in. I haven't given anyone a key. Not family, not friends. Nobody." Mary exhaled slowly. Fear flickered in her eyes. Then we have a problem. I pressed a hand to my forehead. Mary, what exactly did you see? She took a moment gathering her thoughts. Sometimes it was one person, sometimes two. They didn't stay long. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe less. I'd hear the door close and then I wouldn't see anything else until they came back out. Did you hear anything? I asked, feeling my throat tighten. Yes, she said quietly. More than once. The kitchen seemed to grow colder around us. What kind of sounds? Mary clasped her hands in front of her, the gesture of a woman who wasn't sure whether she should speak her next words. When she finally did, her voice trembled in a way I had never heard. It sounded like chanting. I stared at her. Chanting. A low voice. Slow. Repetitive. Not English. It reminded me of those old stories people used to tell back in Montana about isolated groups doing ceremonies they didn't want outsiders hearing. She shivered. It had that same cadence. Like prayer, but not the kind you say in church. A nauseating heaviness settled in my stomach. The strange smell in my house. The sense of presence in my bedroom. The movements of objects. The scraping chair. My family's sudden arrival. Their probing questions. The scratch marks. None of it felt separate anymore. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I whispered. Mary sighed. I wasn't sure what I was seeing at first, and I didn't want to scare you without reason. But after you came out this morning looking like you hadn't slept in days, I knew. I leaned back in the chair, my pulse hammering. I thought I was losing my mind. She reached across the table and laid her hand over mine. You're not. Something is happening in that house, and you need to be careful. What do? I asked, voice barely audible. Her answer came without hesitation, as though she had already rehearsed it. Leave for a few days. I blinked, startled. Leave? Yes, she said. Pack a bag, go somewhere safe, a hotel, a friend's place, anywhere but there, and don't tell anyone you're gone. Mary. Let them think the house is empty, she continued firmly. Let them believe you're out of town. Then watch. Wait. See what they do when they think no one's paying attention. Her tone was so forceful it stopped me mid-breath. This wasn't simple advice. It was instruction born from knowledge, painful personal knowledge. You sound like you've seen this before, I said softly. Her jaw tightened. I have. She looked away, her eyes distant for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice broke with memory. I once knew a woman, an elderly neighbor of mine years ago. Her own family started slipping into her house when she was gone, moving things, leaving signs, making her doubt herself. It was all part of an effort to take her property from her, slow at first, then bold. They wanted her confused, vulnerable, easy to control. A tremor ran through her. They almost succeeded, until we caught them in the act. My breath caught. Mary, are you saying you think my family? She didn't let me finish. She squeezed my hand so tightly I felt it in my bones. Honey, she whispered, her voice trembling with certainty, you are not alone in that house at night. I can promise you that. Mary's words stayed with me long after I left her kitchen. They echoed through me with a clarity that felt heavier than fear, heavier even than the uncertainty swallowing my life. Someone was entering my home. Someone had keys. Someone had been performing rituals, chanting inside my walls. And Mary, calm and grounded as she was, believed my own family might be involved. I didn't want to believe that, but the truth was already pressing against the edges of my mind. The scratch marks on the lock, their strange questions, Julia's hungry glances at every corner of the house I'd worked so hard to maintain, and Mary's certainty about the sounds she'd heard on nights she thought I wasn't home. I kept hearing her say that I wasn't alone in that house at night. As I sat in my car in my driveway that afternoon, hands gripping the steering wheel, I made a decision that felt heavier than anything I'd ever chosen before. I was done being passive. I had to know the truth even if the truth hurt, especially if it hurt. So I did something I never imagined I'd do. I crafted a lie meant specifically for my own family. That evening, I called my mother. I made my voice bright, casual, as if we were the sort of family that shared weekend plans regularly. "I'm heading out of town for a few days," I told her, pacing my living room to keep my tone natural. "College friends are doing a little reunion trip. Thought it might be good for me." Her response was too quick, too interested. "Oh, when are you leaving tonight?" I said. "Just finishing packing." I imagined her nodding, absorbing every detail. "Be safe," she replied, though her voice held a thin line of eagerness that unsettled me. "Call us when you get back." I hung up, exhaled shakily, and got to work. The performance had to be believable, visible, audible, unmistakable. I dragged my suitcase down the front steps, letting it bump loudly so the sound carried across the yards. I made a show of loading it into the trunk of my car, then stood in the driveway talking enthusiastically on the phone about flight times and hotel check-ins. I wasn't actually talking to anyone, of course, but the words flowed easily. At one point, I even paused and laughed at something imaginary, projecting the casual confidence of someone excited for a short getaway. I made sure the garage door opened and closed, then opened again as though I needed to fetch something I forgot. I locked the front door with exaggerated gestures. I wanted it obvious not to my neighbors but to the people I suspected were watching more closely than they let on. When I finally climbed into my car and drove away, the knot in my stomach tightened instead of loosening. I wasn't disappearing for vacation. I was staging an ambush. It felt both empowering and deeply sad. I had never needed to protect myself from my own family before. I drove 3 neighborhoods away, pulled into a small grocery store parking lot, and waited 5 long minutes. Then I looped through a back road, slipped into the alley behind Mary's house, and parked in her detached garage. Mary was waiting by the back door, holding it open with the cautious anticipation of someone who had been preparing for this moment. "Come in quickly," she whispered. "Lights off." I entered her house, closing the door behind me, and she motioned for me to follow her up the narrow staircase to the spare room facing my home. The room had been transformed. A pair of binoculars rested on the window ledge. A small motion-triggered camera had been positioned between 2 ceramic figurines on the dresser pointed directly at my bedroom window across the street. A thermos of coffee sat on the side table beside a notebook and 2 pens. Mary had even placed a thick blanket on the bed and an extra pillow, as if she'd known I wouldn't get much rest, but wanted to give me the option. "We'll keep the lights off," she said quietly. "Silhouettes are easier to spot than faces." I nodded, feeling an odd mix of gratitude and terror. I took a seat near the window, pulling the binoculars into my hands. From here, I could see directly into my own bedroom if the lights inside turned on. The thought made my skin prickle. I wasn't sure what frightened me more, the possibility of seeing my family inside, or the possibility of seeing strangers. As the hours stretched, the house across the street looked serene, undisturbed, exactly as I had left it. But serenity was deceptive now. I knew too much. I found myself jumping at every car door, slamming down the street, every bark from the neighbor's dog. Even the faint ticking of Mary's mantel clock seemed too loud, marking the seconds that crawled slowly toward midnight. At around 10:30, Mary returned with 2 mugs. "Drink," she said. "Long night ahead." I sipped the hot coffee, letting the warmth settle my nerves. "Do you think they'll come?" I asked. She didn't sugarcoat it. "Yes, I do." Her certainty both frightened and steadied me. The 2 of us sat together in the dimly lit room, 2 women watching a house that should have been safe but no longer felt like mine. I realized then that I wasn't just afraid of what might happen tonight. I was afraid of what the truth might force me to confront about the people who raised me. Around 11:15, a movement across the street caught my eye, a shadow passing behind my living room curtains. My breath stopped. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Mary nodded. "They're inside." My fingers tightened around the binoculars, but I didn't dare lift them yet. My pulse beat heavily in my throat. The house remained dark, still quiet. And yet, someone was there. Someone had used a key. I had expected fear, but not this sharp sense of betrayal slicing through me like a physical wound. I thought of my mother's overly warm hug, my father's questions, Julia's calculated glances. Were they in my house right now? What were they doing? The minutes to midnight moved like molasses. I checked the time again and again, unable to trust my senses. It felt as though the entire night was leaning forward, waiting with me. Then at exactly 12:01 a.m., the beam of light I had been dreading and expecting flashed through the darkness. The lamp in my bedroom snapped on. My bedroom, my sanctuary, lighting up as though someone had simply walked in and flipped the switch. Even though I was sitting across the street in Mary's darkened spare room, I felt the bright burst of that light like a punch to the chest. My breath left me in a hard, shaking exhale. Mary whispered only one word, low and grim, her voice shaking with what sounded like both fear and confirmation. There. The house was no longer pretending, and whoever was inside wasn't pretending either. The light in my bedroom burned through the darkness like an accusation, sharp and undeniable. For several long seconds, I couldn't make myself lift the binoculars. Seeing that light was one thing. Seeing who had turned it on was another. My breath came shallow and quick, and my hands trembled as they hovered near the window ledge. Mary stood beside me in silence, giving me space but watching with an alertness sharpened by fear. When I finally found the courage to raise the binoculars, my fingers were cold despite the warmth of the room. I pressed the lenses to my eyes and adjusted the focus until the familiar frame of my bedroom window came into sharp clarity. And then I froze. My back door opened. Not the front, my back door, the one hidden from the street, the one only someone familiar with my house would know how to access quietly. My father stepped inside first. My mother followed, then Julia. Then, all three of them entered with the calm precision of people walking into their own home. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look around. They didn't check for signs of life. They moved with a frighteningly smooth confidence that told me exactly what I least wanted to admit: they had done this before. Many times. I could barely swallow as the truth anchored heavily in my chest. They hadn't just tried to take a key. They had one. Maybe they'd copied mine years ago. Maybe they had found one I didn't realize was missing. Or maybe I had never truly known how far they were willing to go. I watched as they closed the back door behind them and moved down the hallway toward my bedroom like actors hitting their marks on stage. My mother carried a red cloth bag. My father held a wooden box polished to an unnatural sheen about a foot long and etched with symbols I couldn't quite discern from a distance. Julia walked with her chin lifted, her posture almost serene, as if she were entering a sacred space rather than trespassing into her sister's home in the middle of the night. When they reached my bedroom, my father switched on the main light, illuminating the space in a way that made my stomach turn. It was the same room I had slept in for years, yet under that bright glare and with those people inside it, it felt like a stranger's domain entirely. I watched my mother spread the red cloth bag onto my bed, smoothing it with deliberate strokes. Julia took objects out of it one by one: slim black candles, a bundle of red cord, and a shallow ceramic bowl filled with something dark and powdery. Ash. She placed each item with the precision of someone following memorized instructions. My father set the wooden box on the floor, opened it, and pulled out a thick, weathered book. The pages were yellowed, the cover cracked. Even from this far away, I felt the wrongness radiating from it. My mother and Julia began arranging the black candles on the floor, forming a perfect circle. Not approximate, not guessed, perfect, the kind of symmetry that only comes from repetition. I felt a cold shiver trace its way down my spine. "They've practiced this," I whispered. Mary nodded, her face grim but unsurprised. "It isn't their first night in there." My father lit each candle one by one, the flames casting long, warped shadows across my bedroom walls. The light flickered over Julia's face as she reached into the bag again and pulled out something soft and familiar. It took me a moment to realize what it was. One of my shirts. A lavender blouse I thought I had misplaced in the laundry weeks ago. I watched rooted to the spot as Julia carefully cut a square from the fabric and placed it on the floor inside the circle. My own clothing, my scent, my belongings. They had taken something from me without my knowledge and were now using it for whatever ritual this was. My throat tightened so painfully I had to force myself to breathe. My father opened the book and began to read, his voice low and rhythmic. Even through the closed windows, I could hear the cadence. It wasn't English. It wasn't Latin, at least not any Latin I recognized from my years of legal studies. It sounded like Latin corrupted, twisted through some other linguistic structure entirely. My mother placed her hands on Julia's shoulders, bowing her head as if channeling something through her touch. The three of them stood in perfect formation around those candles, around that circle, around the piece of my clothing, like it was some kind of offering. The chanting grew steadier, deeper, more coordinated. I found myself leaning closer to the window, barely remembering to breathe. Then Julia spoke. Her voice carried clearly, cutting through the stillness of the night. Its energy is weakening. We're doing this right. Just a few more sessions. It's not hers, not Claire's energy. It's as if I were an object, a resource, something to siphon. My mother nodded with solemn certainty. My father didn't pause his reading. Their faces were serene, purposeful, disturbingly calm. They weren't conflicted. They weren't ashamed. They weren't scared of being caught. They believed in this, truly believed whatever they were doing was justified, necessary, even righteous. I felt something inside me crack, something small, something old, something that had always assumed on some level that even in their neglect, my family would never deliberately harm me. That illusion died there in Mary's darkened spare room. I gripped the binoculars harder, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. "They think they can take something from you," Mary murmured. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. "They think they're entitled to it." I couldn't respond. My voice had abandoned me. I watched as my father closed the book and lifted his gaze not to the candles or the circle, but to the open doorway of my bedroom. Something in his posture shifted, as if he sensed something, as if he were waiting. And then another figure stepped into the room. A man I had never seen before. He moved with an authority so absolute, it seemed to shift the air around him. Broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing, his presence dominated the space instantly. My parents straightened, Julia's chin lifted, and without anyone speaking a word, I knew. He wasn't a guest, he wasn't an observer. He was the one in charge. My breath caught in my throat. The man walked into the circle of candlelight with the calm confidence of someone stepping into his rightful place. Whatever was happening in my bedroom wasn't just a family delusion. It wasn't harmless superstition. It wasn't desperation. It was something organized, something structured, something led. And now I was staring directly at the person leading it. The moment the stranger stepped into my bedroom, the atmosphere inside Mary's dark, spare room shifted. Even from across the street, even filtered through glass and distance, his presence radiated something heavy and deliberate. He moved with a calm confidence that didn't require raised voices or dramatic gestures. His authority settled over the room like a shadow that had been waiting for its cue. My mother straightened immediately, hands clasped as if in reverence. My father lowered his gaze, shoulders stiff with respect. And Julia, my sister, my own flesh and blood, stood taller, as though the arrival of this man gave her purpose, validation, a sense of belonging she had never found in real life. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare. Beside me, Mary sucked in a sharp breath, the sound barely audible but filled with unmistakable fear. "Dear God," she whispered. "That's Father Harland." I tore the binoculars from my face long enough to look at her. "You know him?" Her expression darkened with something deeper than concern. "Everyone in this county knows him," she murmured. "Or knows of him." She leaned closer as if afraid he might somehow hear her through walls and windows. "He's the leader of that group I told you about, the Circle of Reversal." The name meant nothing to me, but the dread in her voice did. They've been around for years, Mary continued, always operating on the edges, always slipping away before the law can pin anything on them. They get inside people's minds, Claire. Convince them their bad luck is someone else's fault, that someone stole their fortune, their health, their purpose. And then they make them do things to take it back. I felt sick. My family. The words caught in my throat. Saying them out loud made everything real. Mary nodded grimly. Your family is involved with him, and he's dangerous. Nobody walks away clean after being led by a man like that. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I turned back to the window. Harlan stepped fully into my bedroom, the candlelight flickering across his face. He was a man in his late 50s, tall with a spine held in perfect alignment, the way military commanders stand when reviewing their troops. His hair was silver but thick, combed back neatly. His eyes, even from this distance, were sharp, two dark points of focus that seemed to size up everything in their path. The most unsettling thing was the duality in his expression, a kind of practiced warmth layered over something cold and predatory beneath. The false mask and the real face. Julia moved to the center of the candle circle and closed her eyes, lifting her chin as though offering herself up. Harlan placed a hand on her back gently, almost fatherly, and murmured something I couldn't quite hear. Then he straightened, raised both palms slightly, and addressed my parents. We begin the rite of extraction, he said. Even through the walls, I could sense the authority in his tone. My father nodded reverently and opened the old book again, flipping to a page marked with a strip of deep red fabric. My mother stepped behind Julia, resting her hands lightly on her shoulders. It was a formation, a structure, a ritual so clearly rehearsed that it made the hairs on my arms rise. Harlan circled Julia slowly. The imbalance has grown, he said in that calm, almost soothing voice. We've seen its signs. Its luck is swelling unnaturally. Its energy must be redistributed to where it belongs. It's that word again, as if I were not a daughter or a sister, as if I were an object, a resource, something to be drained. My father began chanting again, his voice steady and rhythmic. My mother closed her eyes, breathing deeply as though she were channeling something through her hands. And Julia, my sister, who had once shared bunk beds with me, whispered secrets in the dark with me, cried into my shoulder after her divorce, lifted her arms slightly, palms upward as though receiving a blessing. Harlan looked at her with a mixture of admiration and possession. You have borne the brunt of injustice, he said. Your path has been blocked, your destiny taken. Julia nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her closed eyes. She took it from me, she whispered. My stomach lurched. Me. My sister truly believed that my success, my stability, the life I'd built through years of hard work and sacrifice was something stolen from her, that I had somehow taken what the universe meant for her. Harlan stepped closer to her and placed his hand on her head. His touch was gentle, almost tender, but the intent behind it was anything but. The transfer night is approaching, he said. The night where what she has taken returns to its rightful owner. Julia let out a shaky sigh of relief, a trembling exhale that twisted something deep inside my chest. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't confused. She believed him completely. I knew it, she whispered. I knew I wasn't meant to live like this. I knew something was wrong. My parents murmured words of comfort, encouragement, devotion to the process and to the man guiding them. Harlan's expression softened in a way that might have looked compassionate to someone who didn't understand the manipulation beneath it. To me, it looked like triumph. This wasn't just my family caught up in something strange. They were fully indoctrinated, fully convinced that this ritual, this violation, this insanity was their salvation. I tried to swallow, but my throat was too tight. The betrayal hit me in waves, thick, suffocating, overwhelming. My own family was performing a ritual designed to strip me of something they considered their due. My life. My stability. My future. And at the center of it, orchestrating every piece, was a man who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be harvested. Harlan turned toward the candle circle again, lifting his hands. "We have made progress. Her energy weakens with each session. The imbalance will soon be corrected." My vision blurred for a moment. My family wasn't just entering my house. They weren't just trespassing. They were dismantling me piece by piece, night after night, believing it was justified. Believing I deserved it. I lowered the binoculars for a moment, my hands trembling violently. Mary squeezed my shoulder, her grip firm, anchoring. "I'm so sorry, Claire," she whispered. "I never wanted this to be true." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat as something shifted in the room across the street. Harlan paused mid-sentence. He straightened. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head. And those sharp, dark eyes turned toward the window. Not just toward the window, toward me. Straight at me, as if he could see through the glass, as if he had known all along that someone was watching. My breath stopped entirely. In Mary's spare room, the air went still, and Harlan's gaze held unblinking, as though acknowledging an observer he wasn't supposed to know existed. Then, with a slow, chilling lift of his head, he looked directly where I was sitting. Directly at me. When Harlan's eyes snapped toward the window, Mary yanked the curtain shut so fast it nearly tore off the rod. My breath felt trapped somewhere between my ribs and my throat, and for several minutes we didn't move, didn't speak, barely existed. Eventually, when the silence regained its stillness, we dared to breathe again. But even after the lights in my house went dark and the backyard settled back into its usual quiet, I remained frozen in place. The fear that Harlan had truly seen us, lingered like an electric charge in the air. I barely slept at Mary's that night, and when dawn finally broke, it felt like I had aged 10 years in a single evening. By the time I returned to my house the next morning, the shock had blended into something heavier. A grief. A reckoning. I knew I had to understand how my family had ended up here, kneeling in circles of ash under the guidance of a man like Father Harlan. The ritual I had witnessed wasn't just a crime. It was the culmination of something older, something that had been building for a long time. And the moment I walked through my front door, memories I had avoided for decades began flooding in with startling clarity. My mother had always been drawn to what she called alternative paths. As a child, I had watched her drift from yoga groups to crystal healing to meditation circles to weekend retreats where she'd sit for hours with strangers chanting about aligning their spirit channels. Back then, I thought it was harmless. Strange, but harmless. She seemed to come alive in those rooms more than she ever did at home. I used to sit on the staircase and watch the parade of women entering our living room carrying jars of herbs or books filled with symbols I couldn't understand. My father always rolled his eyes, but he never stopped her. If anything, he enabled it by pretending not to see how much she spent, how many decisions she deferred to whatever guru she was following at the time. What I didn't understand until now was how deeply entrenched she had been. I remembered moments that should have alarmed me more than they did, the time she disappeared for 3 days, leaving only a note that she needed spiritual realignment. The months when she sold furniture and family heirlooms to pay for energy advancement sessions. The way she would stare into space afterward, murmuring phrases that didn't entirely sound like English. She eased out of those groups when I was in high school, or so I thought. Now looking at what she had participated in last night, I realized she hadn't left that world at all. She had only gone dormant, waiting for someone like Harlan to activate whatever belief had been planted in her years ago. But understanding my mother was only part of the puzzle. The deeper and more painful pieces belonged to Julia. My poor sister, always grasping for something just out of reach, always convinced her failures were someone else's fault. Growing up, Julia's envy came in small, sharp jabs, her snide comments when I got good grades, her sulking when relatives praised me for being responsible or steady. I assumed she'd outgrow it. I assumed everyone outgrew childish resentments eventually. Then life handed Julia a series of blows, a marriage that collapsed under the weight of infidelity, a business venture that failed before it even launched credit card debt that ballooned faster than she could keep up with. She spiraled, and no matter how much help I offered, she rejected it with the same refrain. "You don't understand. Everything is easier for you. You always get what I don't." At the time, I had chalked it up to emotional exhaustion. But now I saw that her jealousy had hardened into something more dangerous, a belief that her misfortune wasn't random. It was stolen. Harland hadn't created her resentment, he had simply weaponized it. He had given her narrative form, a mythology where I was the accidental thief of her destiny. According to him, there are people who absorb the good energy meant for someone else, leaving the rightful person depleted. A karmic vacancy, he likely called it. Something that needed correcting. Julia didn't need much convincing. Harland had provided her with a story that made sense of her pain, a story where she could finally be the victim of cosmic injustice instead of a series of her own choices. And that sort of belief, once rooted, is nearly impossible to pull out. It dawned on me then that my family didn't think they were hurting me. They believed they were restoring a universal balance. In their minds, Julia deserved a transfer of luck, fortune, or whatever they imagined I had taken. They saw me as overfilled, swollen with blessings that should have been hers. The ritual last night, the rite of extraction, wasn't just symbolic to them. It was a mission, a religious duty. And Harland had convinced them that the final step, the transfer night, wouldn't just redistribute spiritual energy. It would weaken me psychologically, make me disoriented, unstable, vulnerable. Vulnerable enough to be declared incompetent. Vulnerable enough for them to gain control not just of my house, but of every asset I possessed. When I realized how thoroughly Harland had wrapped them around his finger, it felt like the floor beneath me disappeared. This wasn't a family squabble. It wasn't about money or jealousy alone. It was belief, dangerous, weaponized belief, and people driven by belief will justify things they would never do under normal circumstances. I walked into my bedroom to ground myself, to feel the reality of the space violated the night before. The air felt wrong, stale, and heavy. I turned slowly, scanning for anything out of place, anything at all. My gaze drifted to the edge of the bed, then to the floor, then finally to the shadows underneath the frame. Something glimmered faintly. I crouched down, heart pounding quicker with each passing second. That's when I saw it. Carved directly into the wooden slats beneath my mattress was a symbol. A spiral wrapped around a vertical line intersected by 3 short strokes. It was old, crudely, but deliberately etched, as if someone had taken their time making sure every line was exact. And I recognized it. A chill crawled from my spine all the way to the back of my skull. I had seen that symbol before, decades ago, in one of my mother's old spiritual books she kept hidden from my father. A symbol for opening channels or loosening boundaries, or something equally cryptic. I remember being 10 years old, tracing the lines with my fingers, while my mother told me that some symbols were powerful, meant only for people who truly understood them. I backed away from the bed, my breath trembling. This hadn't begun recently. They had been preparing this space long before I noticed anything strange. Long before I suspected a thing. And if that symbol was here, what else had been hidden in this room without my knowledge? As that thought settled, I realized this was not just a violation. This was a plan years in the making, and I had only uncovered the smallest piece of it. Cliffhanger. As I rose to my feet, my fingers brushed against something taped beneath the bed frame, a thin, folded scrap of paper with my name written on it in my mother's handwriting. My hands were still trembling from the discovery under my bed when I finally forced myself to step back and breathe. That little folded note with my name written in my mother's handwriting felt heavier than any physical object I had ever held. I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. Something instinctive inside me whispered that whatever was written inside would be the kind of truth a person couldn't unknow, the kind that changed the landscape of their life forever. So I placed it on my nightstand and tried to steady myself with the practical knowledge that I needed evidence. Not fear, not speculation, hard evidence. Something I could take to authorities, to lawyers, to anyone who could help me legally dismantle whatever my family had built around me. I waited until late morning when I was certain my family was nowhere near the neighborhood. My father always volunteered at a charity center on Tuesdays, my mother attended her meditation circle, and Julia usually slept until noon on most days, according to her social media posts. That gave me a small window of time, and I took it. Approaching my own house in broad daylight felt surreal, almost like trespassing into someone else's life. Every familiar detail, the porch railing, the cracked stepping stone, the wind chime I bought at a craft fair last summer, seemed to belong to a stranger. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Not dramatically different. Not hostile, just unsettled, like the aftermath of an argument that still lingered in the walls. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, highlighting dust motes drifting through the air. Everything looked normal at a glance. Too normal. A kind of forced normal that I knew was only a thin layer over whatever had happened here the night before. I locked the door behind me and moved through the hallway with slow, measured steps. My first stop was the bedroom. Evidence hides best in places you think are safe, and I knew the ritual had taken place there. Seeing the room illuminated by daylight made my stomach twist into a tight knot. The carpet near the bed was subtly discolored, an uneven shade that even vacuuming couldn't hide. When I kneeled down and brushed my fingers over it, a thin dusting of powder lifted into the air, faint but unmistakable. Someone had drawn shapes here. Circles, lines, something geometric, something ceremonial. The remnants of chalk or ash, or both, clung stubbornly to the fibers. They had tried to clean it, but the faint traces remained. Near the foot of the bed, small specks of candle wax dotted the carpet. I touched one and felt the brittle edge break away beneath my thumb. It was dark, almost black and sticky, in a way that suggested it wasn't ordinary candle wax. There was also a faint, smoky scent lingering in the air, burnt herbs incense, something sharp and medicinal intertwined with something sweet. Seeing all of this in daylight anchored the nightmare into reality. This wasn't imagination. It wasn't stress. It was evidence, straightforward, undeniable evidence that someone had performed a ritual in my bedroom. I moved to the closet next. Something about the closet had been bothering me for days, long before I discovered the symbol under the bed. Not fear, just a subtle awareness that something wasn't quite right in there. When I parted the hanging clothes, a faint metallic scent hit me first, followed by the unmistakable smell of old fabric that had been handled too much. My gaze drifted to the back where an unfamiliar red cloth bag sat tucked behind a winter coat I hadn't worn in years. Seeing it sent a shiver across my shoulders. It was the same color as the bag I had seen my family carry into the house during the ritual. I reached for it, my hands hesitant but steady. The fabric felt worn and rough against my fingers, and when I opened it, a sickening sense of violation washed over me. Inside was a small bundle of my own hair tied together with red cord, several strands that must have been taken from my hairbrush or shower drain. There was also a torn piece of one of my blouses, one I had assumed had been misplaced at the dry cleaner. A second length of red cord was tied in knots. I didn't recognize knots that looked deliberate, ceremonial. And beneath all that lay a photograph of me. It was a picture from last year's company picnic. I was smiling, unaware it was being taken. Someone had drawn symbols on it, dark ink curling around my face, crossing over my chest and circling my head. They weren't decorative. They looked like markings of possession or targeting. My throat tightened. This wasn't just spiritual intrusion. This was personal. Deeply personal. I photographed everything from multiple angles using my phone as if I were documenting a crime scene because that's exactly what it was. With every flash of the camera, anger began replacing the fear. Evidence meant leverage. Evidence meant I wasn't powerless. Still shaken, I placed the items back in the bag, sealing it shut with trembling fingers. Next, I returned to the spot under my bed where the symbol had been carved. If they had hidden one note, perhaps there was more. I knelt and ran my fingers along the wooden slats. That's when I felt something slightly thicker than the carved lines, an envelope taped firmly to the underside of the bed frame. My pulse jumped. I peeled it free carefully and sat back on my heels staring at what felt like Pandora's box. Inside, I found papers neatly stacked, organized with methodical precision. The first document I pulled out made my blood go cold. It was a loan agreement, one I had never signed, for $120,000. The signature at the bottom mimicked mine but wasn't perfect. The slant was wrong, the loop was off. Someone had tried to forge it. Someone who had access to my handwriting. Probably my father. He had always been good at imitating signatures on school permission slips when my mother didn't feel like signing them. The next papers were partially filled psychological evaluation forms. The sections marked observations included phrases like emotional instability, possible mood disturbances, dissociative episodes. Reading them made my vision tilt for a moment. They were building a case against me. On paper. Quietly. Methodically. Creating the illusion of mental decline so they could claim I was unfit to manage my own life. Then came the draft power of attorney forms. Blank spaces left open for signatures that would give full control of all my assets to my parents. All that was missing was my name in the signature line. My breathing grew faster. My fingers shook as I photographed every page. I knew these documents were key. They proved everything Mary had feared and everything Harland had planned. The ritual was never the whole plan, it was the psychological tool. The legal documents were the real strategy. They were planning to take everything, not spiritually, but legally, financially, completely. As I reached the bottom of the stack, I found one more paper. Folded, handwritten brief. My heart lurched. It was written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. Phase 1 complete. She's showing signs. H says we proceed to Phase 2 next week. I stared at the note until the words blurred together. My father. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who carried me on his shoulders at the 4th of July parade. The man who used to tuck me in at night with a kiss on the forehead. He wasn't just complicit. He was planning. And Phase 2 was coming. I sat at my kitchen table with the forged documents spread out around me like debris after a storm. The note from my father, Phase 1 complete, kept replaying in my mind with a dull, sickening rhythm. I wanted to tear the papers apart, but I knew better. Evidence had to be preserved, photographed, catalogued. My emotions could wait. The facts could not. By late afternoon, I had scanned every page with my phone and saved it to a secure cloud folder under a false name. But scanning wasn't enough. I needed someone with legal expertise to look at what I had uncovered, someone who could tell me exactly how deep this went and how much danger I was in. Margaret Hensley was the only attorney I trusted. She was 62, sharp as flint, and had spent her career dealing with financial exploitation cases, mostly elderly victims, sometimes adults with disabilities, and occasionally the rare client who was neither, but had been targeted for their assets. When I called her and told her it was urgent, she didn't hesitate. She told me to come immediately. By the time I arrived at her office, my nerves were frayed. I handed her the envelope of documents without saying much. Margaret didn't need explanation. She began reading the loan papers first, her eyebrows lifting slightly with every page. "These aren't amateur," she murmured. I swallowed. "They forged my signature." "Yes, but look at how carefully," she said. "They matched the pressure pattern, the slant, even the spacing between letters. Someone studied your handwriting very closely." She tapped the corner of the page. This wasn't done by desperation. It was done by someone who understood how signatures are analyzed in loan disputes. I felt a chill. Someone with a financial background? Or legal, she said quietly. But more importantly, Claire, this entire loan application is professionally constructed. The employment history, they put down the inflated income figures, they're tailored to maximize the loan amount against your property value. So you're saying someone coached them, helped them. Margaret looked at me over her reading glasses. Someone didn't just help them. Someone orchestrated it. My breath quickened. My family wasn't smart enough to build something like this alone. But Harland had the calm authority of someone who thrived on long-term manipulation. Suddenly the rituals made a different kind of sense. They weren't the main event, they were the distraction. The real theft was happening quietly, systematically behind the scenes. Margaret moved on to the psychological forms, her expression hardening. "These are dangerous," she said. "If these had been submitted to the right people, or if your family had staged an incident, authorities might have believed them." My stomach tightened. That was their plan. Make me look unstable. She nodded grimly. A two-pronged attack. Psychological destabilization combined with financial manipulation, classic guardianship fraud methodology. She tapped the pages sharply. "This is a playbook, Claire. People have used these tactics to steal entire estates from elderly victims." "But I'm 38, I whispered. Her mouth tightened. "You're not their usual profile, but the tactics don't change. All they need is enough documentation and a narrative that you're mentally compromised. Once that happens, courts can be easily swayed if no one intervenes." A wave of nausea rolled through me. I had walked into courtrooms as a witness before. I had seen how easily judges could make decisions that upended lives. The idea of a conservatorship case against me built by my own family felt like a nightmare designed by someone who understood exactly how to break a person without touching them. Margaret reached for the loan documents again. "This level of sophistication means someone in that cult of your family's didn't join for spiritual reasons. They joined because it gives them access to vulnerable people's lives and assets." "It's a cover," I said softly. "A good one," Margaret replied. "A spiritual group is the perfect camouflage. People don't question odd behavior when they think it's religious. And when something goes wrong, the victims often blame themselves or stay quiet to avoid shame." The realization hit me with a cold clarity. Harlan's cult wasn't about belief. It was a pipeline. Vulnerable people came in searching for hope and left stripped of their finances, their autonomy, or their sanity. My family wasn't the first. They were simply the latest, and they had brought me with them as collateral. After going through all the papers twice, Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "I need you to check all your financial accounts. Everything. Bank statements, credit cards, your credit report. If they forged this, they've done more." I nodded, though dread pooled in my stomach. She handed me her laptop, and I logged into my online banking account. The moment the dashboard loaded, my pulse spiked. Multiple login attempts from unfamiliar IP addresses filled the activity log, some from nearby cities, some from out-of-state servers commonly used for masking locations. My voice shook. "These aren't me." Margaret frowned. "Have you authorized anyone else to access your accounts?" "No," I said. "Never." She clicked through to my account transaction history. "There aren't major withdrawals yet," she said, "but these login attempts mean someone has been testing your security, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they can get." I checked my credit report next, scrolling through the inquiries list. My chest tightened. There were 5 credit checks I had never authorized, insurance companies, a loan agency, even a credit card company I had never dealt with in my life. "Identity theft," I whispered. "Identity building," Margaret corrected. "They're gathering your financial footprint, preparing to impersonate you, or to prove you're losing control of your affairs." The room felt smaller, as if the walls were gradually closing in. It wasn't just my house they had violated. It wasn't just my body through stolen hair or my sanity through staged disturbances. They were invading every corner of my life, leaving no part untouched. Margaret touched my arm gently. "You are in real danger, Claire. This is not a misunderstanding. This is exploitation built on a scaffolding of spiritual manipulation, financial fraud, and psychological coercion." I nodded slowly, forcing myself to absorb her words. "So, what do I do?" "You gather everything," she said. "Every document, every trace, every irregularity. And you tell no one you're onto them. Not a friend, not a coworker, certainly not your family. Right now, your knowledge is your only advantage." Her voice softened. "And you stay away from them, especially the cult leader. These people escalate when cornered." I nodded again, though my mind felt unsteady. As I packed up the papers and prepared to leave, I felt my phone buzz inside my purse. Thinking it was a reminder or a spam notification, I pulled it out absently. But the moment I saw the text, my blood ran cold. Unknown number. Stop digging, Claire. This won't end well for you. I stared at the screen, the words burning themselves into my mind. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And someone wanted me afraid. I was. But I also wasn't stopping. I left Margaret's office shaken by the text message, but even more shaken by the realization that whoever sent it knew exactly when to strike. Fear clawed at my ribs, but I couldn't let it stop me. I drove straight home, locked every door behind me, and sat at my dining table with the envelope of forged documents laid out in front of me. My hands were still unsteady, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. I needed help, real help. Someone who understood how people like Harland operated. Someone who could guide me through the maze of lies, manipulation, and imminent danger closing in around me. That meant returning to Margaret first thing in the morning. When I stepped into her office again, the air smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Margaret sat behind her desk wearing a navy blazer and an expression that told me she had already gone through everything I'd sent her last night. She motioned for me to sit, and I could tell her mind was already working several steps ahead. "I reviewed every document you uploaded," she said, steepling her fingers. "This is not impulsive. This is not sloppy. This is ritual-based guardianship fraud." I blinked at the phrase. "Ritual-based?" She nodded. "Most guardianship fraud relies on manufacturing instability. False medical reports, staged. Incidents, forced medication, things that create confusion or paranoia. But when a cult is involved, the spiritual aspect becomes the psychological trigger. They use ritual to destabilize you and make your reactions look abnormal on paper." A tight chill pulled across my shoulders. "So Harland has done this before." "More than once," Margaret said. "People like him refine their methods over the years. He's a predator who hides behind spirituality to extract money and assets from vulnerable families. This isn't random, Claire. It's patterned behavior." She opened a folder on her desk and slid out a set of notes in her precise handwriting. "I've had 3 clients targeted by groups like this. 2 cases involved fraudulent spiritual leaders. The 3rd involved a so-called inner circle healer who claimed he could redistribute energy. The tactics were nearly identical. First, the victim is made to doubt their environment. Second, financial documents are drafted to make it appear the victim consented to harmful transactions. Third, psychological evaluations are falsified or manipulated. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, guardianship has already begun." I swallowed hard. "How long do I have?" She studied my face before answering. "Not long. I'd estimate your family and Harland have already initiated what they would call the transfer phase. Once that phase begins, they escalate." My breath stuttered. "Escalate how?" "By increasing psychological pressure," she said. "They may try to drug you. They may enter your home more frequently. They may stage incidents designed to make you question your perception. They may even attempt to provoke a public outburst so they can say you're unstable." The room felt colder with every word she spoke, as if the walls themselves were responding. I forced myself to lean in. "So what do we do?" Margaret's answer came without hesitation. "We fight. Strategically." She opened another folder and pulled out a list 6 pages long covered with items typed in crisp black ink. "This is how we begin building your defense. And not just a defense, a counterattack." I exhaled shakily, grateful for the clarity in her voice even as dread crept into my stomach. "First, she said you install hidden cameras in the house. Not optional. They must be small, discreet, motion-activated, and placed in locations where rituals or intrusions have occurred. The bedroom, the hallway, near the back door. and at least one in the living room. I stiffened. Is that legal? You are the owner of the house. As long as they're not in private spaces like a bathroom, you have full legal right. She made a note. Second, you maintain a detailed intrusion log. Every sound, every disturbance, every inconsistency. Time date what you observed, even if you think it's minor. Because it creates a timeline, I said, beginning to follow her reasoning. Exactly. It builds a pattern of unauthorized entry and psychological manipulation. She tapped the loan documents. Third, we preserve every piece of physical evidence. Seal each item in a separate bag, label the date, time, and location found. The more methodical you are, the stronger your case becomes. I nodded slowly. Margaret's steadiness anchored me, giving shape to a plan that felt overwhelming only hours before. And fourth, she continued, we begin a parallel case with law enforcement. That made me stop. Will they take this seriously? They will take the fraud seriously, she said bluntly. The ritual, spiritual activity is protected, but forgery, identity theft, and unlawful entry are not. My stomach tightened. So we can't mention the ritual. We can, she said, but it won't help us build the criminal case. It is, however, crucial context, and it will help explain the psychological component of the scheme when we talk to the right officers and eventually a judge. I absorbed her words, each one settling like a weight in my chest. This wasn't just about stopping my family anymore. It was about dismantling an entire system Harland had built one victim at a time. Margaret leaned forward. Claire, I need you to understand something. This man has done this for years. He knows exactly how to manipulate people into thinking these rituals are harmless or even necessary. Your family has been groomed into believing they're correcting a cosmic imbalance. In their minds, they are not stealing from you. They are reclaiming something. I felt a tremor pass through me. My mother always had those spiritual beliefs. But my father, Julia, I didn't think they'd ever fall into something like this. People don't join a cult because they're weak, Margaret said gently. They join because they're vulnerable in ways they don't understand. Your mother wanted meaning. Your sister wanted justice. Your father wanted stability. Harland offered each of them a story that made their failures feel purposeful. Her words hit with a clarity that made my eyes burn. I wasn't dealing with just manipulation. I was dealing with people who believed they were saving themselves. Margaret stood and walked to her file cabinet, pulling out another thick folder. She placed it in front of me and opened it to 2 case summaries. These are the victims I handled before. They resisted. They found out what the cult was doing too early. And once the cult sensed the resistance, they accelerated. I didn't want to ask, but I had to. Accelerated? How? They staged a medical crisis, she said quietly. Drugged the victims, made them appear disoriented. Convinced an emergency physician to recommend a 72-hour psychiatric hold. During that window, the cult pushed through emergency guardianship hearings and took control of the victims' homes. I stared, unable to speak. Margaret waited until my breath returned before she continued. In both cases, the victims lost their homes in under 10 days after the final phase began. The words drained the warmth from the room, from my body, from everything around me. Margaret met my eyes, her voice steady but urgent. Claire, you are in the same phase now. We have very little time. My heartbeat slowed, then accelerated, then steadied into something sharp and determined. I felt something inside me shift. The fear was still there, but something else rose beside it. Resolve. I swallowed and nodded. Tell me what we do next. Margaret exhaled with a mixture of relief and steel. We move now, she said. Before they do. I walked out of Margaret's office with a plan in my hands and a rising certainty that time was running out. Her warning about escalation had lodged itself deep in my mind, echoing with every breath. People like Harlan didn't retreat when threatened, they accelerated. That urgency followed me home like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I locked every door, checked every window, and tried to focus on the new precautions Margaret had given me. But as I moved through the house, something inside me tightened, a strange awareness of my body that I hadn't felt before. I stood in my kitchen and braced my palms against the countertop. A wave of dizziness washed over me, sudden and strong enough to blur my vision. It passed after a moment, but it wasn't unfamiliar. I'd been feeling versions of it for weeks, each one growing heavier, harder to ignore. At first I blamed stress. Anyone would crumble under the weight of what I had lived through. But now, standing alone in the quiet daylight of my kitchen, every symptom I'd brushed aside felt sharper. There had been the insomnia, not ordinary sleeplessness, but the kind that gnawed at me even when my body was exhausted. I would lie awake for hours with my heart hammering, unable to settle. Then the strange moments where shadows in my peripheral vision seemed to move just slightly enough to make me turn my head only to find nothing there. I had blamed the house, the fear, the rituals. But those symptoms had started long before I saw the first ritual. I pressed my fingers to my temple, and a dull ache pulsed beneath the skin. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. By the time I returned to Margaret the next morning to discuss camera placement, the dizziness struck again, this time so sharply that I stumbled into the arm of her office chair. Margaret didn't miss it. Her eyes narrowed with immediate concern. "How long have you been having symptoms like that?" she asked. I almost said recently, but something made me stop. I realized the truth was more complicated. 3 weeks. Maybe a little longer. What symptoms I hesitated, then listed them. The dizziness, the insomnia, the difficulty focusing, the moments where shapes or shadows seemed to ripple at the edge of my vision, the disorientation that made simple tasks feel harder. Margaret listened without interrupting, but the tension building in her expression told me everything. "Claire," she said quietly, "those symptoms are not normal reactions to stress. Not like this. You need toxicology testing. Today." My stomach lurched. "You think—" "I've seen this pattern before," Margaret said. "When a cult accelerates, they don't rely on ritual alone. They use substances that create confusion. They call it spiritual pressure or cleansing. It's poisoning." The word hit me like a blow to the chest. Poisoning. I sat back, trying to steady my breathing, but the panic rose too quickly. Margaret placed a hand on my wrist, her voice firm and unshakable. "You need to go to the emergency room right now. Tell them your symptoms. They'll run the right panels. And Claire, do not go alone." Part of me wanted to argue. Part of me wanted to be strong, independent, untouched by the terror crawling under my skin. But the truth was too loud to ignore. Something was inside me. Something not natural. Margaret drove me herself. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights felt too bright for comfort. The nurse took me back quickly after hearing my symptoms. Breathlessness, disorientation, visual distortions. The doctor, a middle-aged man with calm eyes and a steady voice, asked detailed questions while taking notes. He ordered an immediate toxicology panel, both blood and urine. The waiting was the worst part. I sat in a small room with a thin blanket wrapped around my shoulders while my thoughts spiraled. If my family had been entering my house for weeks, if they had access to everything in my kitchen, my refrigerator, my storage, what was stopping them from tampering with the things I consumed every day? The terrifying answer was nothing. Nothing at all. 3 hours later, the doctor returned. His expression had changed. He sat down, closed the curtain for privacy, and folded his hands before speaking. "Ms. Matthews, your toxicology panel came back positive for scopolamine." My breath left my lungs. I stared at him, unable to speak. He continued gently, as if delivering bad news to someone standing on a ledge. "It's a compound that causes confusion, disorientation, difficulty concentrating, and sometimes hallucinations. It has legitimate medical uses in very controlled doses, but it's also used criminally because it can impair judgment. Based on the levels in your bloodstream, you've been ingesting small amounts regularly for at least 2 to 3 weeks. I shook my head. How I don't take anything. I don't use anything like that. It was almost certainly introduced into something you consumed, he said. Food or drink. It can be mixed into liquids without strong taste. I covered my mouth with my hand. A tremor ran down my spine so sharply that I felt my knees weaken. The doctor exhaled slowly, his voice firm but sympathetic. I'm filing a mandatory report with the police. This is considered suspected poisoning. My heart pounded as if trying to break free. Do you think someone did this intentionally? Given the pattern and duration, he said yes. This wasn't accidental exposure. The words hung between us like smoke. Police officers arrived not long after, 2 of them both professional and serious. They asked questions, took notes, and insisted on escorting me home so a forensic specialist could collect samples. It was surreal walking into my home surrounded by law enforcement, but it also felt strangely validating. Proof. Evidence. The danger I had felt wasn't imagined or exaggerated. The specialist moved with quiet efficiency, testing every opened container in my kitchen. He swabbed the milk carton, tested a bottle of juice, and checked the water pitcher I refilled daily. When he looked up, his expression confirmed everything. There are traces of scopolamine in multiple items, he said. Based on the distribution, it looks like someone has been adding it systematically. Systematically. The word stabbed deep. My legs gave out, and I sat down hard in the nearest chair. The officers exchanged a glance but said nothing while the specialist bagged each contaminated item individually. I didn't need anyone to tell me who had access. The back door, the rituals, the chalk, the forged signatures, the symbol under my bed, the photograph with markings, the scratches on the lock, the shadow in the hallway, the voice chanting, the red cloth bag. My family's probing questions, Harlan's cold stare. Piece by piece, the nightmare was forming a single shape. This wasn't spiritual. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't misguided. It was an organized, deliberate attempt to dismantle me from the inside out. After the police left, the house felt dark even with the lights on. I sat on the couch shaking, trying to process what the doctor had said, what the specialist had found. I felt the fear in my bones, now not abstract or distant, but as real as the poisoned liquids in evidence bags. My phone lit up on the coffee table. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something made me reach for it. A voicemail notification appeared on the screen. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room, warm and familiar in a way that twisted my stomach. Claire, honey, we're worried about you. Your behavior has been so erratic lately. We think you might need help. We love you. Call us. Every word was gentle. Every word was a weapon. And every word confirmed the truth they were accelerating. I sat frozen after listening to my father's voicemail, the sound of his voice lingering in the air long after the message ended. The tone, the soft concern, the carefully measured warmth clashed violently with everything I knew now. It was the voice of a man pretending to worry while actively trying to destroy me. I replayed it once more, forcing myself to listen not as a daughter but as someone gathering evidence. Every word was a chess move. Every pause, a trap. By the time the message ended, a cold resolve settled in my chest. I knew what came next. The cameras had to go up today. The officers had encouraged it, and Margaret insisted it was essential. My home, the place that should have been my refuge, had become a crime scene in progress. I installed 6 cameras, tiny motion-activated devices barely larger than a thumb drive. One in the kitchen, one near the refrigerator, one pointed at the back door, one in the hallway where the shadows had moved, one in the living room, and one angled at my bedroom door, capturing anyone who stepped inside. The house felt different with the cameras in place. Not safer, nothing felt safe anymore, but clearer. Documented. Observed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the watcher instead of the hunted. After finishing the setup, I tried to lie down and rest, but exhaustion didn't bring sleep. My thoughts ricocheted through my mind, replaying everything: the rituals, the symbols, the forged documents, the poisoned food. I knew the truth, but I needed undeniable proof, something no one could spin into a misunderstanding or a delusion. The next morning, with a sense of dread pressing on my chest, I opened the camera app on my phone and began reviewing the last week's footage. The screen filled with a grid of thumbnails, each one a potential key to understanding how deep this nightmare went. Most clips were ordinary me walking through the hallway, turning off lights, opening the refrigerator. Nothing remarkable. But then I saw something that made my heartbeat stutter. A motion alert from 3 days earlier, mid-morning, while I was at work. My fingers trembled as I tapped the file. The footage opened and the timestamp glowed in the corner. My kitchen appeared in sharp resolution, illuminated by natural light. For a moment, no one was there. Then the back door began to open slowly, deliberately. Not pushed, not forced, unlocked. Someone had a key. My father stepped inside. I stopped breathing. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause to check whether anyone was home. He moved with crisp efficiency, closing the door behind him before slipping a pair of latex gloves over his hands. I felt nausea rise up my throat. He walked straight to the refrigerator. There was no confusion, no searching. He knew exactly where everything was. He opened the fridge and reached into his jacket, pulling out a small glass vial. My stomach twisted when he unscrewed it with casual familiarity. He poured a clear liquid into my milk carton, then into the water pitcher. Then he opened the juice bottle on the second shelf and added a few drops there as well. His movements were so practiced, so precise, that it was obvious this wasn't the first time. He finished, wiped the vial with a handkerchief, placed it back into his pocket, and closed the refrigerator. Without lingering, he walked out the back door, glancing around the kitchen, as if checking his work. I stared at the screen long after the video ended. My father, the man who steadied my bike when I first learned to ride, who coached my softball team in middle school, who once brought me soup when I was sick, had been poisoning me. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. With intent. With planning. With ritualistic calm. I replayed the footage 3 more times, each viewing scraping another layer of numbness from my mind. There was no ambiguity, no possibility of misinterpretation. This was deliberate poisoning captured on camera. The betrayal ran so deep it felt physical, like something inside me had torn. But I wasn't done. I opened more motion alerts. 48 hours ago. My mother entering the house with a grocery bag that wasn't hers, replacing items in my pantry with nearly identical versions labels. The same packaging, the same, but contents likely tainted. 72 hours ago. Julia slipping into my bedroom with her hair tied back, placing something under my pillow. I paused the footage and zoomed. It was the same red cord I had found tied around my hair strands. The pattern was undeniable. The poisoning hadn't been random. It matched the timeline of every symptom, every strange night, every moment I had doubted myself. They had been dismantling my ability to think clearly long before I understood what was happening. When Detective Sarah Reeves arrived later that afternoon, she reviewed the footage with a professional detachment I couldn't maintain. Sarah was in her early 40s with short auburn hair and an expression that never softened even when she was being kind. She watched my father poisoning the milk without blinking. "This is solid evidence," she said. "It's enough to pursue charges of attempted poisoning, breaking and entering, and possibly attempted homicide depending on dosage levels." I swallowed thickly. Homicide. The word hung in the air like smoke. Sarah replayed the footage, making notes. He used gloves. He avoided cameras, he just didn't know you installed new ones. That means experience. Planning. He's done this kind of thing before, maybe not poison, but controlled intrusions. She glanced at me. This is not a man acting out of confusion or desperation. This is someone following a plan. I nodded weakly. Sarah moved through the rest of the footage and then turned her attention to the documents Margaret had helped me collect. She flipped through forged loan papers, psych evaluation drafts, and the power of attorney forms with a grim understanding. "This is a coordinated operation," she said. "Poisoning to destabilize you. Fraud to build a legal trail. Ritual to keep your family compliant and emotionally invested." She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "You're dealing with 2 layers. The cult is one. But beneath that is a white-collar crime ring that uses the cult as cover. That makes prosecution tricky." I frowned. "Tricky how family complicates things," she said. "When relatives commit crimes under the guise of concern, courts hesitate. They'll claim they were intervening in what they thought was a mental health crisis. And Harland will position himself as a spiritual guide, not a co-conspirator." A hollow ache formed under my ribs. "So what do I do?" Sarah folded her hands. "We build a stronger case. You already have evidence of poisoning. Now we need evidence of intent, conspiracy, financial gain. We need them to incriminate themselves." Fear prickled through me. "How do we get that?" "By letting them continue," she said. "Under surveillance." My pulse raced. "You're asking me to act like nothing is wrong?" "Yes," she said calmly. "People like this make mistakes when they think their plan is succeeding. You need to stay on the outside, let them believe the poison is working, let them escalate publicly. That's when we strike." A cold weight settled in my stomach. Sarah's tone darkened, her eyes fixed on mine. "We need to let them think they're winning," she said. "That's when people like this make mistakes." I left the house shaken from what I'd heard on the audio recording, Detective Reeves's warning still echoing in my mind like an unwelcome prophecy. Let them think they're winning. The idea still felt like walking willingly into a burning building, but I understood the strategy now. Exposure required patience, timing, and watching my own family pretend to care while sharpening the knife behind their backs. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to steady my thoughts until the anxiety in my chest forced me to pull over at a small cafe several miles from home. I sat in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the faint red imprint my fingers had left on the leather. I couldn't go home yet. I couldn't sit in the silence of that poisoned house without feeling like the walls were leaning in to remind me how close I'd come to losing myself. As I sat there, my breath still uneven, I noticed a familiar silver sedan pulling into the grocery store across from the cafe. It was my mother's car. Before I could process what that meant, the passenger door opened and Julia stepped out. For a moment, I simply watched, my vision blurring at the edges as something inside me cracked open. She looked different. Not the sharp, almost smug woman who had stood in my living room weeks earlier. She looked exhausted, pale, fragile. A protective hand rested against her abdomen as she walked behind our mother toward the store entrance. Instinct made me sink lower in my seat. Watching them felt wrong, intrusive. But a deeper part of me, the part that was fighting for my life, held me still. I waited while they went inside my nerves, buzzing beneath my skin. When they came out again with drinks in hand and stopped near their car to talk, I cracked my window just slightly. Just enough to hear. At first their voices were soft, almost swallowed by the distant hum of traffic. Then Julia's voice rose, trembling with something raw and painful. "I can't lose another one, Mom. I can't." The words pierced through every layer of anger I'd built to survive the last weeks. My mother stepped closer and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You won't, sweetheart. Father Harlan said the energy transfer will hold. He promised this pregnancy will be protected." The ground beneath my feet felt like it shifted. Pregnancy. Protected. Energy transfer. Each word hit in slow, echoing impact. I stared at my sister with wide eyes, suddenly seeing her through a different lens. 14 weeks pregnant. Something she hadn't told me. Something she had hidden while breaking into my home and poisoning my food. The betrayal cut deeply, but so did the realization of what she was carrying: fear, hope, grief. Julia pressed both hands over her belly as if shielding it from the world. But what if it doesn't work? What if this baby? What if I lose again? My mother's voice softened with a tenderness I remembered from childhood. You won't lose this child. Harland has helped women in worse situations. He said the imbalance will be corrected once the final transfer is complete. A tremor ran down my spine. Imbalance. Correction. Final transfer. The language of the cult wrapped around every syllable. My mother continued, her voice low but urgent. Remember what Dr. Ramon told you about the test results? I stiffened. Dr. Ramon. Test results. My mother touched Julia's cheek gently. He said the NIPT showed chromosomal risk, that conventional doctors can't stop what's already written in the DNA, that only spiritual intervention can strengthen the baby's life force. I leaned forward involuntarily. Chromosomal risk, NIPT. Medical fear was one of the sharpest tools manipulators used. If Julia had lost pregnancies before, she would have clung to any hope, no matter how irrational. Julia's face crumpled. He said my aura isn't stable enough, that the baby is clinging but weak. He said I can't carry it to term unless we fix the imbalance. And we will, my mother assured her. We're doing exactly what he told us. Claire doesn't need all that energy. She won't even notice once the transition is done. Air rushed from my lungs. I sat frozen in my parked car, staring at the two most familiar people in my life as they spoke about me like a resource to be harvested. They weren't trying to destroy me because they hated me. They were trying to destroy me because they believed my suffering would save Julia's child. My mother continued, soothing her. You deserve this, sweetheart. You were meant to be a mother. Harlan saw that in you immediately. Julia nodded, tears streaking down her face. If this doesn't work, I don't know what I'll do. I feel like I'm going crazy. I just want the baby to live. The grief in her voice sliced through me. I remembered her joy the first time she was pregnant. I remembered the despair when she miscarried. Twice. I had never heard her cry like this, not even during her divorce. The agony was real, but the actions she'd taken because of it were still unforgivable. I watched them get into the car and drive away, but I couldn't move. My breath shook uncontrollably. Tears blurred the world until all I saw were shapes merging into each other. I wasn't just fighting a cult. I wasn't just fighting my parents. I was fighting my sister's desperation. And somehow that made everything harder. Eventually, I forced myself to drive home, though my hands shook on the wheel the whole way. When I stepped inside my house, its familiar air felt colder, heavier. I sank onto the couch, pulled out my phone, and opened the camera app to review the audio feeds recorded while I'd been gone. I needed to hear more. I needed to understand the full extent of what they believed. The minute I pressed play, Julia's voice drifted from the speakers clearer than the conversation I'd overheard earlier. She was inside my bedroom again, the place where the rituals had taken place, where my sense of safety had already been stolen. Harlan says we're close, she whispered. The baby just needs a little more. He said Claire's energy is thinning. That means the transfer is working. My chest tightened painfully. My mother murmured something supportive, her voice too faint to make out. Julia inhaled shakily, then spoke with a conviction that didn't belong to the sister I once knew. The baby is all that matters. I'll do whatever Harlan says. My breath stopped. Even if it means... Her voice faltered, then steadied with chilling resolve. Claire doesn't need to be healthy to sign papers, right? I felt my heartbeat slam so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs. There was no misunderstanding left, no rationalization, no faint hope that Julia was being dragged along. She wasn't just participating, she was willing to damage me, willing to incapacitate me, willing to reduce me to a signature on a document if that's what Harlan told her would save her child. I covered my mouth with my hands as sobs shook my chest, but beneath the grief, beneath the heartbreak and betrayal and horror, something else began to grow. A cold, deliberate fire. My family wasn't simply misguided. They weren't just being manipulated. They were willing to sacrifice me for a promise that should never have been theirs to believe. And if they thought I would collapse quietly, they had forgotten who I was long before this nightmare began. I barely slept after hearing Julia's voice on the audio feed, her trembling words echoing again and again in my mind. Claire doesn't need to be healthy to sign papers, right? It was the kind of sentence that changed something fundamental inside a person. Something broke in me that night, but something hardened, too. Fear could no longer guide me. Grief could no longer silence me. If I was going to survive this, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. I needed answers deeper than tears and betrayal. And I needed proof strong enough to destroy everything Harland had built. The next morning, I saw my father's truck pull away from his neighborhood. On impulse, I followed him. I kept my distance, pulse-pounding hands slick against the steering wheel. He didn't head toward work or home. He drove past the city limits down a rural road lined with old barns and wide fields until he turned into the cracked driveway of a run-down rental property hidden behind a grouping of oak trees. I parked far enough away to stay out of sight and watched him step inside the small house with an ease that suggested he came here often. When he finally left, locking the door behind him and driving off, I waited another 10 minutes, then approached the house. The windows were covered from the inside with thick curtains. I tried the door. Locked. But I had learned enough from weeks of intrusions to know how flimsy these locks could be. I used the small pry tool Margaret insisted I carry and felt the latch slip. The door creaked open. The air inside was cold and heavy, thick with the scent of old incense and something metallic. I stepped in slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. What I saw made my body go rigid. It was a shrine, not decorative or symbolic, but functional, operational. A long wooden table stretched across the center of the room, covered with black and red candles, bowls filled with ash, bundles of dried herbs, knives, whose blades looked worn but sharp. Strange sigils were carved into the table surface, lines and circles intersecting in a pattern that made my skin crawl. Rope ritual cords and glass jars filled with substances I couldn't identify lined the shelves. The walls were worse. They were covered in photographs. Dozens, maybe over 100. Some were old faded snapshots of strangers. Others were more recent, printed on glossy paper. A few faces I recognized from my mother's old spiritual circles, women who used to come to our house on weekends seeking healing or guidance. Several photos had large red X marks across them. 2 photographs were torn in half, and one prominently displayed in the center was circled in thick red marker. It was me. The word written underneath it made bile rise in my throat. Primary. For a moment, all I could hear was my heartbeat slamming in my ears. I forced myself to breathe as I moved closer, scanning the photos more carefully. The red X's snapped into awful meaning. These weren't members. These were victims. Targets. People who had been part of the cult's rituals, likely drained of their finances or their stability or their autonomy. And now my face hung among them, the next name, in a long line of lives stolen or destroyed. In the corner of the room stood a desk cluttered with papers. A thick ledger lay open, its pages filled with dates, names, symbols, and what looked like ritual notes. I began turning the pages, dread twisting into a tight knot in my stomach. 2 names had entire sections dedicated to them, each marked with the phrase, "Complete transfer." Their entries listed ritual gatherings, emotional preparation phases, and then financial outcomes. The details were chilling. Bank transfers, guardianship documentation, property seizure. Both names had newspaper clippings attached. One described an elderly woman who signed her estate over to a caregiver and died months later in a nursing home. The other detailed a middle-aged man who developed rapid-onset dementia. His sister had taken legal control of his finances shortly before he deteriorated. I remembered both stories vaguely. They'd made small-town news years ago. Rumors had circulated, but nothing was ever proven. Now I knew why. The cult had perfected the script long before they reached my family. My hand shook as I turned the pages. These weren't coincidences. These were past victims mapped with the precision of a predator cataloging trophies. I kept moving through the room, needing everything. A narrow door in the back wall caught my eye. It led to a small closet with boxes stacked haphazardly. Something about the space felt off, as if the clutter was staged. I moved a few boxes and noticed a loose board near the floor. Instinct pushed me to pull it free. Behind it lay a weathered leather journal tied with a thin ribbon. My breath hitched. I knew that handwriting before I even opened it. My mother's. The first page was dated 15 years earlier, long before Harlan's name entered our household openly, long before my family pretended to drift away from spirituality. I began reading each line, tightening a cord around my chest. She wrote about meeting Harlan at a retreat, about his presence, his charisma, his promise that he could restore balance to families burdened by misaligned energy. She described how she had confided in him about Julia, how fragile she had been even as a teenager, how easily disappointed, how she struggled academically and emotionally. Harlan, she wrote, told her Julia was spiritually blocked and that I was absorbing the good fortune meant for her. My mother wrote about the early sessions, the energy consultations, the money she and Stephen paid for rituals and blessings. I read her confusion, her doubts, her fear that Harlan's influence over Stephen was too strong. Then I reached an entry that made my fingers go numb. Harlan wants me to harm Claire. He wants me to weaken her so Julia's path can open. He says Claire has taken too much life energy and it must be returned. I refused. I told Stephen it was wrong. Stephen believes him. He told me if I don't help, he will do it alone. I'm afraid of losing my husband if I fight this. Claire is strong. She'll be fine. God forgive me, I'm choosing to stay quiet. I felt the room tilt slightly. 15 years. 15 years of silence about a threat she recognized. 15 years of watching me grow, succeed, build a life knowing Stephen was capable of harming me for the sake of restoring what he believed Julia had lost. My throat closed as tears blurred the ink on the page. I turned the final entries with trembling hands. One was dated a year later, written in shaky, uneven script. Harlan is growing stronger. His reach is everywhere now. Stephen is fully devoted. I'm losing both of them. I see what they are planning for Claire and I can't stop it. I don't know how. I am a coward. I chose my marriage over my daughter's safety, and it was the wrong choice. The last entry felt like a blade against my heart. If Claire ever finds this baby, run. Run far away. I made the wrong choice. Don't let them convince you this is love. It's not. I'm so sorry. I closed the diary with both hands hugging it to my chest as a sob wrenched through me. My mother knew. She knew who Harlan was. She knew what Stephen was willing to do. She saw what was forming around our family, and she stayed silent because the price of speaking was too high. Her final apology felt like a ghost whispering over my shoulder. But it didn't change the truth. My family wasn't just lost. They had been conditioned, primed, and participating for nearly 2 decades. I wasn't facing a sudden betrayal. I was stepping into a war that began years before I even understood I was in danger. And now I had proof, not just of their crimes, but of their intentions, their history, their willingness to sacrifice me. I slid the diary into my bag, took one last look at the shrine, the photos, the ledger, and the word primary scrawled beneath my face. Then I slipped out of the room, locked the door behind me, and drove away with my mother's final words echoing with every heartbeat, "Run, baby. Run." Leaving the rental house with my mother's diary pressed against my chest felt like carrying a live wire. Every word from those pages burned through me, each sentence reshaping what I thought I knew about my past, my family, and the forces that had been circling around us for years. I drove straight to Margaret's office, my breathing uneven, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles shook. I didn't trust myself to go home. Not yet. Not with what I had just seen. When I walked into her office and placed the ledger, the photos, and the diary on her desk, Margaret's usually steely composure flickered. She took her time reading, flipping through each page with slow precision. Her forensic accountant, a quiet man named Daniel Whitmore, joined us midway through. Margaret called him after seeing the ledger entries. She didn't even wait for me to finish describing the shrine. Daniel had a talent for numbers that bordered on eerie. He barely glanced at the financial entries in the ledger before he started making notes. Dates, amounts, names, routing patterns. When I finally stopped talking, he closed the ledger, adjusted his glasses, and looked at me with a seriousness that made the room feel colder. "Claire," he said, "what you've stumbled onto is far bigger than your family. Much bigger." Margaret crossed her arms. "Start with the shell companies." Daniel nodded and pulled up his laptop. I traced the destination account associated with the loan documents we found. If that loan had been approved, the funds wouldn't have gone to your parents or even to anyone directly tied to Harland. They would have been transferred through 2 shell corporations registered in Nevada and Delaware. He tapped the screen and turned it toward me. "These companies don't produce anything. They don't employ anyone. They exist solely to move money." My pulse quickened. How much money? Daniel clicked another file. Over $3 million in the last 2 years. The air left my lungs. $3 million. That wasn't a small local scam. That wasn't the work of a misguided spiritual leader exploiting a handful of lost people. That was a structured pipeline, a system. Margaret leaned closer. "So Harland isn't operating alone?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "In fact, based on the volume and distribution of funds, he's not even high in the chain. He's middle management. A recruiter, not the architect." A strange mix of fear and anger rose in my throat. "A recruiter?" Daniel nodded. "He identifies vulnerable families, convinces someone inside the family that another member is spiritually imbalanced, and then funnels that family into the ritual-based fraud process." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "There are patterns across multiple states, nearly identical methods, identical timing, identical outcomes." Margaret lifted a page from the diary. Her mother recognized the danger 15 years ago. "This goes back decades." Daniel turned back to his notes. "Harland is one part of a larger structure, something called the Restoration Circle." I frowned. Restoration Circle, I've only heard them call themselves Circle of Reversal. "That's one branch," Daniel said. "The Restoration Circle is the parent organization. They operate in at least 6 states that we've been able to confirm. They recruit through grief counseling groups, spiritual retreats, wellness centers, and alternative therapy workshops. They look for people who are vulnerable, those dealing with loss, illness, financial stress, or family rifts. Once someone is emotionally invested, they're slowly drawn deeper, convinced that their suffering is caused by a spiritual imbalance that must be corrected." I felt a chill crawl along my spine. "And the correction involves harming someone they love." Margaret nodded grimly. "Or convincing them to." "It's psychologically devastating. The perfect gaslight. They turn victims into accomplices." Daniel added, "The Restoration Circle identifies primary targets, usually relatives who have stable finances, property, or retirement accounts. They then manipulate the family into believing the primary target holds an unfair share of life energy or good fortune." My stomach turned as I recalled the red circle drawn around my photograph in that room. "Primary." Margaret continued reading from Daniel's findings. "There are likely 200 active victims right now," she said quietly, "at various stages of exploitation. 200. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. 200 people living my nightmare. 200 families being torn apart. 200 lives slowly drained of stability and sanity." I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to steady my breathing. "How many people are running this?" "We don't know yet," Daniel replied. "But Harland isn't at the top. He submits reports, regularly." Margaret's eyes sharpened, to whom Daniel pulled up another file. "Law enforcement granted us access to Harland's email server through a subpoena. Many messages were encrypted, but we recovered fragments. Enough to identify a pattern." He clicked open a document. "Harland reports to someone called Sister Evelyn." The name felt chilling in its simplicity. Margaret leaned in. "Is she part of Claire's mother's old group?" "No." Daniel answered. This is higher level. She appears to be a regional coordinator overseeing operations across multiple states. From the emails we could decrypt, she reviews the progress of various subjects. That's their word for victims. I inhaled sharply. Subjects, Daniel nodded. They don't use names, just numbers. You are. Subject 7. My stomach clenched. How many subjects are there? We found references up to Subject 42, he said, across multiple branches of the organization. I stared at the screen, nausea rising again. My family hadn't betrayed me alone. They had been coached, conditioned, and manipulated by people who saw me not as a daughter, not even as a target, but as an asset. A number in a ledger. A step in a ritualized extraction process. What do the emails say? I asked quietly. Margaret pulled up the highlighted sections. Here are a few. She read the first one aloud. Subject 7 progressing as expected. Family fully committed. Phase 2 initiated. Expect property transfer within 30 days. My head spun. 30 days. They thought they were that close to taking everything from me. Daniel pointed to another email. Ensure psychological documentation is thorough. We cannot afford another reversal like the Portland case. I tightened my grip on the arm of the chair. What happened in the Portland case? We don't know the details, Daniel said, but the language suggests the victim gained clarity too early or law enforcement intervened before the cult could secure legal guardianship. Margaret met my eyes. Which means they're very aware of the risk of exposure, and they adapt quickly when a target shows resistance. I swallowed. Do they know I'm resisting? Margaret hesitated before answering. Not yet, and we need to keep it that way. Daniel reached for his laptop again. There's one email you need to see. He clicked it open and slid the screen toward me. The timestamp sent a bolt of ice down my spine. It was dated 2 days ago. I leaned in to read Sister Evelyn's message. If Subject 7 shows awareness of surveillance, accelerate to final protocol immediately. We cannot allow exposure. The room grew impossibly still. My skin prickled with cold. Final protocol. Margaret reached over and placed a steady hand on my arm. Claire, she said, her voice low but urgent. This means your timeline is even tighter than we thought. If they suspect you know the truth, they will escalate. Fast. Even faster than they already had. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing air into my lungs. I thought about my father poisoning my milk with calm, practiced hands. I thought about Julia whispering that I didn't need to be healthy to sign papers. I thought about the shrine with my face circled in red marked as primary. And I thought about Sister Evelyn, a woman I had never met, watching my life unfold through digital reports, preparing to send the next instruction. My family wasn't the final threat. They were just the tools. Harland wasn't the mastermind. He was just the recruiter. The real danger was a network designed to consume people like me. And they knew my name. They knew my face. They knew my timeline. Subject 7. I opened my eyes, feeling something settle in my chest. Not fear this time, but a cold, steady determination. If they wanted to accelerate, they would find me ready. I left Margaret's office with the weight of Sister Evelyn's warning sitting like a stone in my chest. Accelerate to final protocol. They were prepared to move decisively the moment they sensed I knew too much. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to disappear, to obey the desperate plea in my mother's diary. But running wouldn't save me. Running wouldn't stop them. Running wouldn't protect the next subject on their list. The only path forward was to expose them thoroughly, undeniably, in a way the law couldn't ignore or reinterpret. That meant gathering evidence stronger than forged documents, stronger than my word, stronger even than the poisonous substances found in my kitchen. Margaret warned me that cult-aligned families were slippery in court. They cried about mental illness. They claimed good intentions. They said they were trying to help the victim. She told me plainly, you need them on camera, not chanting, not performing rituals, planning fraud. and that meant we needed them to return to my house while believing I was elsewhere. So that afternoon I parked my car 2 streets away and walked quietly to Mary's house, keeping low behind hedges and driveways. She greeted me with that steady, weathered strength she carried, ushering me into the spare room where the monitors were already set up. Lines of live footage showed every corner of my house in crisp detail: my living room, my kitchen, my bedroom, even the small hallway where the shadows always seemed a little too long. I sat at the table with Mary beside me, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes trained on the screens. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply said, "We'll watch together." At first, the house remained silent. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, turning everything too bright, too peaceful, like the calm before the gut punch. Margaret had told me that if Harland intended to escalate, he would do it soon. They needed to keep me destabilized. They needed to keep each step of their fraudulent narrative moving. And then, at 3:17 p.m., the motion alert flashed. Door movement. Back entrance. My breath caught. Mary adjusted the volume. On the screen, my father entered first, calm as ever, using a key he was never supposed to have. My mother followed, clutching her purse to her side. Julia came last, looking pale and tense, her hand resting protectively over her abdomen. And then Harland entered with slow, deliberate steps, scanning the room like a commander assessing a battlefield. I felt my nails dig into my palms. They walked directly into my bedroom, the place where I slept, the place where I'd once felt safe. Now it had become their meeting chamber. Harland stood in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, and said, "We're on schedule, but I want everyone here clear on the timeline." His voice was smooth, almost bored. My father nodded eagerly like a soldier awaiting orders. My mother looked anxious but obedient. Julia hovered behind them, watching Harland with the devotion of a disciple. Harland continued, "Claire's medical records now show 3 weeks of psychiatric symptoms: disorientation, insomnia, hallucination, adjacent reporting." The ER visit helped us immensely. It established a documented pattern. I felt Mary tense beside me. I swallowed the urge to scream. Harland lifted a small notepad. "The forged loan closes in 10 days. Once that goes through, we proceed with financial consolidation. But before the legal transitions, we need one more ceremony to push her into an observable breakdown. After that, Stephen files for emergency guardianship, citing her inability to manage her affairs." My father nodded as though receiving sound fatherly advice. My stomach twisted. Harland looked at each of them calmly. "Any questions?" And that was when the camera caught the moment that sealed everything. My mother lifted her hand slightly, wringing her fingers. "How much of the medicine does she need?" she asked softly. "I'm worried about giving her too much." My breath hitched so sharply it hurt. Lorna Matthews, my mother, worrying about poisoning me, not because it was wrong, but because she feared overdoing it. Harland responded with that same clinical steadiness. "The dosage is calculated to cause disorientation and anxiety without being life-threatening. We need her symptomatic but not hospitalized." "You're doing fine, Lorna." "Fine." As though they were discussing a baking recipe, not a methodical dismantling of my sanity. He continued, "Keep to the schedule. We need her to deteriorate at a steady pace. Sudden escalation looks suspicious." Mary muttered under her breath. "That's it. That's your proof." And she was right. This wasn't ritual. This wasn't spiritual. This was conspiracy. Criminal conspiracy being laid out bullet point by bullet point. My father leaned toward Harland. "If she doesn't break down with the next ceremony, do we have alternatives?" My whole body raced with cold fury. Harland nodded. "If needed, we can introduce a secondary destabilizer, but I prefer not to. Sudden declines attract attention." Julia spoke, then her voice trembling. "We just need it to work. The baby needs it." Harland gave her a small, indulgent smile. "It will work, Julia, but timing is important. You'll get what you deserve." I watched her press a hand to her stomach. For one brief moment, my anger cracked. but only for a moment. Then Harlan began pacing. Slow, measured steps around my bedroom, the place where he'd stood to manipulate my family and direct the poisoning of my life. He walked with a confidence that made my skin crawl. And then, without warning, he stopped. Right in front of the wall where one of our hidden cameras sat disguised within a vent grill. My pulse leapt painfully. He turned his head, looking straight at the lens. His gaze locked onto it with the precision of a man who knew exactly where each camera was placed. I gasped, jerking back from the monitor. Mary grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Don't move." Harlan stared for several seconds, his expression unreadable. Then, to my horror, he smiled. A small, almost kind smile, something intimate and chilling. He didn't disable the camera. He didn't alert the others. He simply turned away and resumed giving instructions as if nothing had happened. As if he owned the room. As if he owned me. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Cult leaders use psychological warfare. When they know you're watching, they perform for you. They want you rattled. They want you destabilized. They want you to believe that even when you see the truth, you're powerless to stop it. The meeting began to break up. Harlan smoothed his shirt sleeves, glanced around one final time, then headed toward the door. But just as he crossed the threshold, he paused. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head back toward the camera. And with perfect clarity, his lips shaped the words. "See you soon, Claire." My entire body went cold. I didn't sleep the night after Harlan stared into the camera and mouthed those words, meant only for me. "See you soon, Claire." They clung to me like smoke seeping into every corner of my mind, no matter how many times I tried to shake them off. I spent the next 2 days moving through the world with a tightness under my skin, as if at any moment a hand might close around my shoulder. Margaret urged me to stay inside or stay with someone, but I couldn't bear the walls closing in around me. I needed a few minutes of normalcy, something simple and ordinary to convince myself I still existed outside the cult's design. So on the second morning, I drove to a small coffee shop just outside my neighborhood, a place with gentle music, warm lighting, and the familiar comfort of people reading newspapers or tapping at laptops. I ordered chamomile tea and sat near the window with my hands wrapped around the warm cup, breathing in the faint scent of honey and lemon. For a few minutes it felt almost peaceful. I let myself believe I was invisible, untouched, safe. And then the bell above the door chimed. My eyes lifted automatically and the bottom of my stomach dropped. Harlan walked in as if he'd been expected, as if this coffee shop was his stage, and he was simply stepping into his cue. He scanned the room with a casual glance, but the moment his eyes reached mine, his expression softened into a pleased smile. That smile, gentle, knowing, utterly confident, was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Before I could stand or react or even look away, he walked straight to my table and sat across from me without asking. "Good morning, Claire," he said, his voice smooth as silk, warm as sunlight. "You look tired today." My throat tightened. I couldn't speak. I wasn't sure I trusted my voice not to break. He gestured to a passing barista. "Tea, please. Earl Grey." Then he folded his hands on the table and looked at me as if we were dear friends catching up. "You've been under a tremendous amount of stress," he said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." I stared at him, trying to steady my breathing. He leaned in slightly. "Stress makes us see threats where none exist. It makes us misinterpret the intentions of those who care about us." The barista returned with his tea. He thanked her warmly, then turned that warmth back on me. "Your family loves you, Claire. They're worried. They think you've been overwhelmed. Losing sleep. Feeling watched. Feeling unsafe in your own home." His gaze held mine with chilling patience. That must be frightening. A tremor passed through my hands and I forced them under the table. He played the role of a concerned confidant so convincingly that anyone watching would assume he was a therapist or a mentor trying to help a distressed woman steady herself. But beneath each gentle word there was a razor edge. I managed to say, "You don't know me," He smiled kindly. But your family does. And they've described such painful moments. You think people enter your home. You believe someone is poisoning you. You feel watched. He tilted his head slightly. That's a heavy burden to carry alone. His voice lowered, growing almost hypnotic. Sometimes when we cling too tightly to material things, houses, independence, financial control, we drown beneath the weight. I've seen many good people collapse under pressures they weren't meant to bear alone. He let that sink in before continuing. Your parents only want to help you, to protect you. My pulse hammered in my ears. Protect me from what? He gave a small sigh as if heartbroken by my inability to see the obvious. From yourself, Claire. From your fear. From the narrative you've built around ordinary family concern. I gripped the edge of the chair to keep from shaking. Every word was a performance designed to undermine my reality, to reinforce the file they were assembling to prove I was unstable. Harlan took a sip of tea, savoring it. Your home is too large for one person. Managing your finances alone is too much responsibility when you're under emotional strain. Independence is admirable, but it can become dangerous when a mind is troubled. He reached into his pocket as he spoke, pulling out a small white card. He placed it gently on the table between us, his fingers brushing the surface with deliberate care. The card bore a symbol drawn in black ink, curved lines, crossing through a circle identical to the symbol carved beneath my bed. The room seemed to shrink around us. Harlan stood adjusting his coat. Tonight is significant for your family, he said softly. A milestone in their spiritual journey. They're ready to restore balance. Resistance at this stage will only make the transition more painful for everyone involved. He paused, giving me a look that might have passed for sympathy if I didn't know the monster beneath it. Your family isn't your enemy, Claire. They're trying to save you from the illness you can't see. He turned and walked toward the door with unhurried grace. His posture relaxed, his presence lingering like smoke. Just before he stepped outside, he looked back and nodded once as though we had reached an understanding. When the door closed behind him, I finally exhaled. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the card. The incense scent clinging to it hit me immediately, the same scent that had soaked the air of my violated bedroom. I flipped the card over. Neat looping handwriting filled the back final transfer ceremony. Tonight, your presence requested. The words blurred as my vision tightened around them, a cold wave of dread rising through my chest. This wasn't just a warning. It was a deadline. The ambulance doors slammed shut behind Julia, and for a moment I stood frozen in the parking lot, the cold night air stinging my skin. Everything had happened so fast, the police raid, the screaming, the chaos, the way Julia collapsed in my arms, clutching her stomach, convinced her baby was dying. Even after everything she'd done, the fear in her voice cut straight through me. Now, as the paramedics sped toward the hospital, all I could do was follow in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers throbbed. When I arrived, nurses were already wheeling Julia into an exam room. I wasn't allowed back yet, but I could hear her somewhere down the hall, sobbing, gasping for breath, insisting the baby was in danger. Her voice cracked with terror. I sank into a plastic chair in the waiting room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Margaret and Detective Reeves arrived minutes later, still shaken from the ritual site arrests, but determined, focused. Reeves updated an officer at the desk while Margaret sat beside me, placing a steadying hand on my arm. "It's going to be all right," she murmured, though her eyes said she wasn't certain. The fact that she collapsed from panic and not violence is at least something. I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. Julia's desperation wasn't something that could be patched with medical reassurance. It ran deeper, rooted in fear, manipulation, and grief she'd never allowed herself to process. After what felt like hours but was barely 20 minutes, a doctor in green scrubs approached us and asked if I was family. When I said yes, he guided me to a quiet corner. "She's stable," he said gently. "Her heart rate and blood pressure were elevated from a severe panic attack, but physically she's fine. And the baby," he smiled. The baby's heartbeat is strong and steady, completely normal for this stage of pregnancy. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. So she wasn't miscarrying? Not at all. There's no sign of bleeding, no contractions, nothing indicating distress. The doctor hesitated, frowning, but she kept saying her baby was dying. She was absolutely convinced of it. Do you know why she'd think that? Before I could answer, Julia's voice rose sharply from the exam room. But doctor, Ramon said the baby had abnormalities. He said it wouldn't make it another month. He said I needed help, he said. Her words dissolved into ragged sobs. The doctor looked baffled. Whoever told her that was wrong? And dangerously so. Margaret stepped forward. That's part of why we're here, she said, handing him a printed copy of the prenatal report Julia had received. Could you look at this? We need an immediate medical opinion. The doctor scanned the document, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. This isn't a legitimate medical report, he said firmly. The terminology is mixed incorrectly, and the described chromosomal abnormalities don't correspond to any recognized pattern, and no licensed physician would suggest spiritual intervention as a primary treatment for a high-risk pregnancy. This is fabricated. I felt a cold twist in my gut, even though part of me already knew. Detective Reeves stepped closer. The man who wrote that report, Dr. Ramon Vasquez, has been taken into custody. We suspect medical fraud practicing outside his specialty and involvement in a criminal organization. The doctor shook his head in disgust. Your sister wasn't informed she was traumatized. Someone wanted her terrified, compliant, and dependent. Whoever convinced her the baby was dying should never be allowed near a patient again. Through the open doorway, I saw Julia sitting up in the bed, knees drawn to her chest, shaking violently. A nurse tried to soothe her, but Julia's eyes were wide and empty, staring at the floor as if she were trying to make sense of a world that had just collapsed beneath her feet. I stepped inside. She looked up at me, tear-streaked her face, pale and blotchy from crying. Claire, she whispered, her voice hoarse. They said the baby's fine. They said nothing was wrong. Her lips trembled. But Dr. Ramon told me I had to act quickly or... She shook her head in disbelief, the horror dawning slowly. He lied. He lied to me. He lied about everything. I approached slowly like one might approach a wounded animal. Julia. He said the baby was dying, she cried. He said the rituals would save it. He told me the universe made a mistake and gave you my luck. He said if I didn't fix it, I'd lose another baby. Her voice cracked so violently it made my chest ache. I believed him. Oh, God, Claire. I believed him. Her sobbing grew louder, rawer, until she folded forward, gasping. I held her shoulders as she shook. For the first time, I saw not the sister who betrayed me, or the woman who poisoned me, but the frightened girl underneath the one who had miscarried twice, who had lived with grief I never fully understood, who had been told by someone she trusted that her only hope of becoming a mother depended on destroying me. We stayed like that until she exhausted herself into silence. 3 days passed. The ritual site arrests made the news. Dr. Ramon's fraudulent practice was shut down. My father and Harland were held without bail. My mother was released pending further investigation, though she barely spoke a word when I saw her escorted away. Julia was discharged from the hospital with instructions to rest and avoid stress. On the third night, the phone rang. It was my mother's voice, high and fractured. Claire, please, come quickly. Julie, she won't wake up. I ran. When I arrived, paramedics were loading Julia onto a stretcher, her face slack, her skin ashen. A bottle of sleeping pills lay open on the nightstand beside her. My mother was screaming, clutching her own hair, begging Julia to hold on. I followed the ambulance again, but this time the dread was deeper, heavier, colder. In the ICU, machines beeped steadily. Julia lay motionless, eyes closed, tubes and wires surrounding her. Hours passed before her eyelids fluttered. When she finally saw me, tears pooled immediately. "I'm sorry," she whispered so faint I had to lean in. "I'm so sorry, Claire." I took her cold hand in mine. "I just wanted to be a mom," she sobbed weakly. "I wanted something good. And Harlan said you had stolen my chances. He said the universe owed me. I believed him because I was desperate. I believed everything. I helped them poison you. I helped them take your house. I let them hurt you because I thought it would save my baby. I don't deserve to be a mother. I don't deserve to live." I felt my throat close as she tried to turn away in shame. I tightened my grip on her hand. "Julia," I whispered, my voice breaking, "you're not the only victim here. But you can help me stop them from doing this to anyone else." Her breath hitched, and for the first time she didn't look away. I walked out of the ICU after speaking with Julia, my legs trembling from the weight of everything she'd confessed. Her voice, barely audible and drenched in regret, echoed in my mind long after I left her room. I wasn't sure how to carry all of it, the betrayal, the grief, the manipulation that had twisted her into someone capable of harming me. But I also knew something had shifted. She wasn't my enemy anymore. The real enemy was larger, colder, and far more deliberate. When I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed with a message from Margaret asking me to come to her office immediately. The urgency in her words made my chest tighten. I drove straight over, bracing myself for whatever new disaster awaited. The moment I walked into her office, I saw it on her face. She wasn't angry or confused. She was grim, the kind of grim that comes with news that alters the ground under your feet. "Sit down, Claire," she said softly. I didn't move. "Just tell me." She closed a file slowly, as though choosing each movement with care. "I found something while reviewing property and financial records related to your case. Something extremely serious." My stomach clenched. "What did they do?" Margaret took a steady breath. "Your house has been sold." For a moment, the words didn't register. They floated in the air, unreal, impossible. "What?" My voice cracked. "No, that's not possible. I never signed anything." Margaret nodded. "I know. And that's the problem. Someone filed a power of attorney on your behalf 3 days before the final ritual was interrupted. It was notarized and submitted along with a property sale contract." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Who filed it, Stephen?" she answered. "He used a forged power of attorney to sell your home to a shell corporation called Mountain Trust Holdings, LLC. The purchase price was far below market value. The sale is in escrow right now, and unless we stop it, the transfer will finalize in 30 days. I sank into the nearest chair. My entire body felt hollow. "They've done this before," Claire Margaret continued gently. "Multiple times. It's a core part of their system. They destabilize a victim, create the illusion of incompetence, then transfer assets using forged authority. The money is routed into their network, and by the time the victim realizes what happened, the property is gone for good." My throat tightened painfully. I can't believe this. My house. My mother's house. "Everything I have, I know," Margaret said. "But listen, we caught it before escrow closed. That means we still have a chance." I looked up sharply. "What chance?" "A temporary restraining order," she said. "We can file a TRO to freeze the transfer immediately. If we act today, a judge can review the motion within the next day or two. If granted, it halts everything until a full hearing." And the hearing, I asked. The hearing is where we prove the power of attorney was forged, that Stephen acted without consent, and that the sale is part of a fraudulent scheme. I ran a shaking hand over my face. "Can we win?" Margaret hesitated. "We can present strong evidence, but the cult will respond. Stephen will claim you voluntarily granted him power of attorney. They'll argue this is all part of your mental instability, and that your family stepped in to protect your assets. They've used this tactic in other cases, and they know how to manipulate the narrative." A surge of anger flared in my chest. "So, if they win," I lose my house. Yes, she said simply, and they'll have proven their system works again. I pushed myself to my feet, pacing across the room. What do you need me to do? Margaret stood as well. You need to sign affidavits contesting the power of attorney. Submit a declaration documenting every incident of fraud and coercion, and gather all your evidence videos, documents, records. We must file before the end of the day. I nodded, forcing myself into action mode even as fear throbbed behind my eyes. Then let's do it. We spent hours assembling everything. I recounted every violation, every intrusion, every symptom of poisoning. Margaret typed while I spoke, her fingers moving quickly, shaping my chaos into legal precision. Detective Reeves forwarded additional statements from officers who had witnessed the ritual site arrests. Daniel, the forensic accountant, sent documentation showing the connection between Mountain Trust Holdings and other cult-controlled entities. When we finally finished, Margaret reviewed the stack of documents with the sharp eye of someone who'd fought these battles before. We file this now, she said. Then pray the judge reviewing motions tomorrow understands the urgency. I followed her to the courthouse, exhaustion weighing on my limbs, adrenaline pushing me forward. After submitting everything, Margaret placed a hand on my shoulder. You did everything right today, she said. Now we wait. I nodded, though calm felt miles away. Everything in my life was now suspended: my home, my safety, even my future. Waiting felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. By the time I drove home to Mary's house, the sun had vanished and the world felt muted heavy. I tried to breathe through the panic rising in my chest. When I reached the porch, a certified envelope waited at the door, propped neatly against the welcome mat. My name was printed across the front in sharp black letters. I picked it up with trembling hands and tore open the seal. The first line hit me like a punch. Notice of pending guardianship petition. Claire Matthews has been identified as potentially unable to manage her own affairs. My vision blurred as the rest of the words swam before me. They were moving forward. They wanted control of my life. And their next step had already begun. I barely slept after receiving the guardianship notice. Even once exhaustion finally forced my eyes shut, my mind kept jolting awake with flashes of worst-case scenarios. Someone showing up at the door with papers declaring me incompetent, police escorting me out of my own home, the escrow closing behind my back with no hope of reversal. By the time morning light crept across the ceiling, I felt hollowed out. But I also knew something crucial. As Margaret kept telling me, the evidence is real, solid, and overwhelming. The truth was on my side. I had to trust that. 48 hours after we filed the emergency motion, we stood inside the courthouse hallway outside Judge Patricia Hendricks' courtroom. My palms were damp, my heart beat fast and shallow. I could feel tension radiating through my shoulders. Margaret stood next to me, reviewing her notes, her calm presence grounding me. She always carried herself like a woman who had survived storms and learned how to harness them. She didn't just believe we could win. She believed the law itself was on our side, and suddenly I needed that belief more than I needed air. You're going to be fine, she said quietly without looking up. The facts speak for themselves. Across the hallway, my parents stood with their attorney, Richard Morse. He wore a sleek charcoal suit and a carefully controlled expression that suggested he'd already crafted a full narrative in his mind. Stephen played the role of the heartbroken father perfectly, shoulders slightly hunched, lips trembling faintly, as if this entire ordeal pained him deeply. Lorna held a damp tissue pressed to her cheek, blinking rapidly like a woman on the verge of tears. I tried to imagine how many times they had practiced this performance, how many innocent people had been swayed by these same expressions. For a moment, grief hit me unexpectedly. Grief that these were the two people who had raised me and now were preparing to testify that I was mentally unstable. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors and we filed in. The space was high-ceilinged and solemn, the walls lined with shelves of thick legal volumes. Judge Hendricks sat at the elevated bench, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and an air of practiced authority. She glanced at the documents before her, then looked up with a measured expression. "This is an emergency hearing regarding a request for a temporary restraining order," she announced. "Ms. Chen, you may proceed." Margaret stood, her calm voice filling the room. "Thank you, Your Honor. Today we present evidence of a complex scheme of fraud, coercion poisoning, and identity theft directed at my client Claire Matthews. The urgency of this TRO lies in the imminent loss of Ms. Matthews' home due to a forged power of attorney and fraudulent property transfer currently in escrow." Judge Hendricks nodded, giving her permission to continue. Margaret began with the foundation unauthorized entry captured on hidden cameras. She played the first video. The image appeared on the courtroom monitor, crisp and undeniable. Stephen walked into my kitchen as if he lived there, moving with familiarity and purpose. He opened my refrigerator, reached inside his coat, and poured liquid from a vial into my milk carton. His hands were steady, unhurried. Then he moved to my water pitcher and did the same. A ripple of discomfort passed through the courtroom. Even Morse shifted in his seat. Margaret paused the video. "This clearly shows Mr. Matthews committing an act that aligns with the toxicology report we will present next." She introduced the lab results detailing the presence of scopolamine in my bloodstream. She described its effects: confusion, hallucinations, paranoia, all symptoms the respondents claimed were signs of my declining mental health. Then she moved methodically through the chain of custody for the tested food items, confirming they were contaminated inside my locked home. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, listening intently. Next came the most damning footage. Margaret played the recording of Harland, my parents, and Julia in my bedroom, not performing a ritual this time, but planning. Their voices echoed across the courtroom. "We need one more ceremony to push her into observable breakdown," Harland said calmly. "Dosage seems to be working," Stephen added. "She's been more disoriented." Lorna's voice trembled. "I worry about giving her too much." Harland responded gently, like a teacher guiding anxious students. "The calculation is precise. It will weaken her without endangering her life." Margaret let those words hang in the silence. Even my parents looked rattled hearing themselves in that context. The veil of spirituality stripped away the cruelty exposed as plain intent. Margaret continued by introducing bank statements, forged signatures, and digital access logs showing unauthorized attempts to enter my financial accounts. Then she called the handwriting expert, who explained the inconsistencies in letter formation and pressure in the forged power of attorney. He pointed out how signature strokes stopped and started in unnatural places, evidence of someone copying rather than signing fluidly. Next came the obstetrician reviewing Julia's fraudulent prenatal report. She explained that the abnormalities listed simply did not exist in legitimate medical literature. Her voice remained firm, her professional indignation clear. "This document was created to manipulate a patient psychologically," she concluded. Finally, Margaret presented the emails between Harland and Evelyn obtained legally through subpoena. When the court heard the phrase Subject 7 progressing as planned, I felt my pulse spike. Subject 7. That was me. A numbered target in a system that had likely destroyed multiple lives. When it was time for the defense, Morse rose with a solemn expression. "Your Honor, what we are witnessing is a family's attempt to care for their daughter during an emotional crisis. Many of the so-called incidents were hallucinations induced by her own mental deterioration. The respondents engaged in spiritual practices, nothing more. Their intentions were pure." He held up the fraudulent psychological evaluation forms. These evaluations document Ms. Matthews' decline, her paranoia about being watched, her delusional belief that family members were harming her. Then he called Stephen to the stand. Stephen walked with careful, almost saintly hesitation. His voice trembled as he spoke about watching me slip away, about how he couldn't bear to see me suffering, about how I pushed everyone away. He didn't shed tears, but the performance was engineered to land with emotional impact. When Margaret cross-examined him, she remained unflinching. "Mr. Matthews," she said softly, "can you explain why you entered your daughter's home while she was gone and poured liquid from a vial into her milk carton?" Stephen paled visibly. I don't recall doing that. Margaret played the video again. The courtroom air tightened. Do you deny that is you? Margaret asked. Stephen couldn't answer. After that, the defense had nothing left. Morse attempted a few more arguments, but each fell apart under the weight of concrete evidence. Judge Hendricks sat silently for a long moment reviewing her notes. When she finally spoke, her voice held absolute clarity. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, video documentation of contamination of food toxicology reports confirming poisoning evidence of forged signatures, unauthorized access to financial accounts, and recordings of coordinated efforts to induce psychological distress, I am granting the emergency temporary restraining order. All property transfers, including the sale of Ms. Matthews' home, are hereby frozen. She paused briefly, her eyes shifting toward my parents. Furthermore, I am ordering this entire case file to be forwarded to the district attorney for immediate criminal review and prosecution. This hearing is concluded. Her gavel struck with finality. My knees weakened with relief so profound it nearly brought me to tears. I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. For the first time since this nightmare began, justice didn't feel like a distant ideal. It felt possible. It felt real. And the people who tried to destroy me would finally have to face the truth they thought they could bury. Walking out of the courthouse after Judge Hendricks' ruling felt like stepping into a different world. The air outside seemed lighter somehow, as if the universe had shifted an inch back into alignment. My legs were still shaky from the adrenaline of the hearing, but relief pulsed through me in slow, deep waves. For the first time in months, I felt the faint sensation of solid ground under my feet. Margaret hugged me tightly and then left to file the post-hearing paperwork. Detective Reeves headed back to finalize the criminal referral. I lingered alone for a moment on the courthouse steps, letting the victory settle gently into my bones. When I returned to Mary's house, I found her standing on her porch waiting for me. Her expression was soft, almost solemn. She didn't rush toward me, didn't greet me with congratulations. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Come inside, sweetheart," she said quietly. "We need to talk." I followed her in. She had set the dining table with 2 cups of tea and a spread of old photographs that covered the polished wood surface like scattered memories. Some were black and white, others soft-colored prints from the 90s. My eyes were immediately drawn to one in particular, a young woman in her mid-20s, smiling at the camera with a spark that felt familiar somehow. Long dark hair, warm eyes, a tilt of the head that reminded me of Mary's kindness. "This is my daughter," Mary said, lowering herself into the chair across from me. Her name was Sarah. The past tense landed like a quiet blow. I sat down slowly. "You never mentioned her." Mary nodded, her hands clasped in her lap. "I know, and I should have. But some stories take decades before a person finds the courage to tell them, and sometimes it takes meeting the right person to open that door." She looked up at me with eyes that glistened faintly. "After what happened today, I think you deserve the whole truth." She reached for a photograph of Sarah standing in front of a small bookstore holding a cup of coffee and laughing. Sarah was 26 when everything started. She had just gone through an awful divorce and lost custody of her little boy. She was raw searching, desperate to find meaning in a life that had broken her heart. Her voice wavered for a moment, but she steadied it before continuing. One day, she went to a meditation workshop at a wellness center. It was run by a group that called itself Harmony Path Collective back then. Different names, same people, same strategy. They preyed on vulnerability the way wolves stalk injured deer. Sarah was ripe for it. They told her she had special spiritual gifts, that she'd been unfairly burdened by the world, that the universe owed her reparations. My heart twisted in recognition. They told her someone had stolen her rightful fortune, Mary said, her voice turning brittle at the edges. And they convinced her that someone was me. I leaned in slightly. They targeted her bonds the same way they targeted mine. Yes, Mary whispered. And they were very good at it. They made her believe I was withholding money that spiritually belonged to her. Back then, I had remarried a man who had done well in business. Sarah saw me living comfortably and believed because they told her over and over that I was ignoring her suffering. She picked up another photo of Sarah, this one harder to look at. Her eyes looked sunken, her smile thin. They performed rituals, Mary said softly. They told her those rituals would cleanse karmic blockages and restore her rightful inheritance. But it was all designed to isolate her, convince her I was the obstacle to her rebirth. My throat tightened. Mary, I'm so sorry. She gave a faint, grateful nod, though sorrow clouded her eyes. Thank you, dear, but I need to finish. She took a deep breath and reached for a thick envelope. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, a power of attorney, a quitclaim deed, bank transfer authorizations. They forged my signature on half of these, she said. On others, Sarah signed them willingly because she truly believed she was doing something sacred, something the universe demanded. She gave away her inheritance and access to everything she had. I lifted one paper gently. The scribbles looked rushed, uneven, the faint shakiness of someone under manipulation. She left home and moved into one of their compounds. Mary continued. And once she was fully under their control, they drained her dry, emotionally, financially, spiritually. Her jaw trembled slightly before she steadied it. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. She wouldn't listen to me anymore. She said I wasn't her mother spiritually, that I was blocking her enlightenment. I tried to get law enforcement involved, but without her cooperation. They said she was an adult making her own choices. Her hands twitched slightly as she adjusted a photo of Sarah sitting cross-legged with cult members behind her. She died at 28. Driving alone at night to another cult location across the country. She must have fallen asleep at the wheel. The car swerved into a ravine. Silence rested heavily between us. I reached out and touched her hand. The ache in her eyes was deeper than grief. It was the agony of a mother who lost not just a daughter, but the chance to save her. When I saw Harlan standing in your bedroom window, Mary said after a long pause, I felt like I'd stepped into the past. I saw Sarah standing exactly where Julia stood, that same look of devotion, that same hunger for a life that kept slipping out of her hands. Her voice thickened slightly. I couldn't save my daughter. She was too deep into their lies, too far gone to listen. But you fought them from the beginning. You questioned everything. You didn't let them fracture your reality. I swallowed hard. You helped me do that. She gave a sad, proud nod. I knew the signs. I recognized Harlan immediately. His face hasn't changed much in 20 years. When you told me about the intrusions, the smells, the strange rearrangements, my blood ran cold. I knew it wasn't random. I knew exactly what he was doing. She stood, walked to a small metal box on the counter and brought it to the table. When she opened it, she removed a folder several inches thick. She placed it gently in front of me. This, she said, is everything I collected after Sarah died. Financial statements, ritual notes, photographs, letters she wrote that explained the group's ideology, details about others they targeted before her. I kept it all. I couldn't let go. Part of me was waiting for someone who could finish what I couldn't. I touched the folder with reverence. This could help the DA. It will, Mary said with quiet certainty. Their pattern hasn't changed in decades. They just adjusted the names, the faces, the spiritual language, but the blueprint is the same. She placed her hand over mine. Sarah would have been 48 now. About your age group. Sometimes I like to believe the universe brought you to me as one more chance. One more woman I might still save. Her voice softened to a whisper. One more chance to stop them. I spent the night after Mary's confession, lying awake in her guest room, staring at the faint lines of moonlight on the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the photographs she'd shown me spread across her dining table, saw the light in Sarah's eyes, saw the way it dimmed in the later pictures as the cult pulled her deeper into its grip. I kept hearing the tremor in Mary's voice as she admitted she couldn't save her daughter, and beneath all of it was the unbearable weight of her final words. You were my second chance. By dawn, exhaustion had settled into every one of my bones. But something else lived beneath it resolve. If everything Mary collected could finally expose this network, if everything I had survived could help stop them, then I would carry that responsibility for both of us. Just as I poured myself a cup of coffee in Mary's kitchen, my phone rang. It was Margaret. Her tone was calm but carried a charged energy beneath it. "Claire," she said, "the district attorney escalated your case to the U.S. Attorney's Office last night. Federal authorities are taking over." My breath caught. Federal? You mean yes. The FBI. I sat down heavily at the table. Hearing that word made everything real in a way even the courtroom hadn't. This wasn't just a family disaster anymore. This was criminal conspiracy on a scale I had never imagined. When Margaret arrived to pick me up, she carried a briefcase stuffed with documents, affidavits, spreadsheets, pieces of a puzzle so enormous I had only begun to grasp its shape. As we drove to the federal building, she explained everything with the solemn confidence of someone who had seen large-scale cases before. "The financial trail crosses multiple states," she said. "Your case alone shows evidence of identity theft, forged legal documents, attempted guardianship abuse, and chemical incapacitation. But once Daniel traced the shell companies to Nevada and Oregon, that pushed it across state lines. It qualifies under RICO statutes." I blinked at her. "Like organized crime. Exactly like organized crime," she said. "Because that's what it is." At the federal building, we met with agents from the FBI Financial Crimes Division and prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The conference room was packed 15, maybe 20 people. A wall of monitors displayed charts, timelines, and financial flows that connected dozens of shell companies. I sat near Margaret while they presented what they'd uncovered during the preliminary review of our evidence. Mary's archive bridged the past. My case provided the present. Daniel's tracing revealed the pattern repeated hundreds of times. Each revelation seemed more staggering than the last. 200 documented victims. 12 years of financial transfers and forged documents. More than $15 million in stolen property. A network of complicit professionals, notaries, therapists, lawyers, medical personnel. They weren't just breaking laws, they were running a structured, sustained criminal enterprise built on exploitation, psychological manipulation, and deliberate destruction of families. It made me sick to realize I had been one of many. After 2 hours of discussion and review, a tall, gray-haired agent named Forrester spoke. "We're moving forward with coordinated warrants. This qualifies for multi-state operation. We'll conduct simultaneous raids at dawn." A current of stunned silence swept through the room. Even Margaret looked momentarily taken aback by the speed of the escalation. 5 days later, it happened. I woke at 6 in Mary's house to a barrage of messages. Margaret's text arrived first. "It has begun." Then Detective Reeves called. Her voice carried the electricity of a woman in the middle of a major operation. "Claire." She said the raids started at sunrise. Multiple states. I stood frozen in Mary's kitchen as she relayed updates fed to her phone minute by minute. Agents stormed the main cult retreat center in Montana, a sprawling cabin compound tucked into wooded hills. Members were handcuffed, evidence confiscated, entire rooms photographed and logged. Harland was arrested at his home. Reeves described him as strangely calm, almost as if he had been expecting this moment. Dr. Ramon tried to destroy files when agents entered his clinic. They stopped him, seized his records, and took possession of his computers, his storage drives, even his personal safe. His license would be suspended within hours. Richard Morse's law firm was searched from top to bottom. His paralegal told investigators he had ordered her to shred papers earlier in the week. Now those shredded pieces were being collected and bagged by gloves, hands to be reconstructed. The raids spread outward like shock waves: Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, Washington, Colorado. Office spaces used for the shell companies were exposed as empty shells, desks with no personal items, mailboxes overflowing with unopened envelopes, computers running only bookkeeping software. Not businesses at all. Just fronts. Stephen was arrested at Lorna's apartment. Reeves didn't give details, but I could imagine the scene, his shoulders sagging. The smooth performances finally cracking now that the costumes were gone and the audience was the federal government. But one arrest didn't happen. Evelyn was missing. She had fled her house days earlier, apparently sensing the legal noose tightening. By noon, the FBI placed her on multiple watch lists. I didn't realize how hard my hands were shaking until Mary wrapped her arm around my shoulders. 5 days passed. 5 long days filled with exhausted pacing calls from Margaret, updates from Reeves, trembling anxiety, and a strange, fragile hope. On the evening of the 5th day, my phone rang again. Reeves didn't even say hello. They have her. I sat down quickly before my knees could give out. Airport security at Seattle-Tacoma International flagged a woman attempting to board a flight to Mexico City with a suspicious passport. The data chip was faulty. Her behavior was odd. When agents checked her bag, they found $40,000 in cash, several IDs under different names and electronics. It was Evelyn. When the FBI arrived, she tried to protest, tried to pull away, demanded a lawyer, attempted to shut her laptop too late. They immediately sent the device to their digital forensics unit. Within hours, the magnitude of what they found ricocheted through the investigation. A database of all current victims, potential future targets, dozens of financial spreadsheets documenting transfers, shell company ownership structures, internal communications among leaders, photographs, surveillance notes, psychological assessments, ritual plans. It wasn't just a trail. It was the blueprint of the entire empire. It was everything the FBI needed to dismantle the organization permanently. I didn't speak as Reeves explained it all. My eyes blurred. My lungs felt too tight to expand. She finished the report, exhaled slowly, then her voice softened. "Claire, I need you to understand something important." I swallowed, my throat thick. "What is it?" During these raids and arrests, we uncovered 47 active cases. 47 people in various stages of being targeted. Some were days away from losing their homes. Others were already being isolated or psychologically manipulated. One was about to sign over her small business. Her pause held the weight of lives saved. "Because you fought back," she said. "Because you documented everything, because you didn't break. We can save them. You stopped this." A long, shaking breath escaped me. Tears blurred my vision. Mary, sitting beside me, placed her hand over mine and squeezed gently. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt its ending starting to take shape. Not just for me. For every woman like Sarah. For every person trapped. For every future victim that would now never exist. The cycle had finally been broken. In the weeks after the FBI raids, my world went strangely quiet. The chaos, the terror, the nightly uncertainty, all of it abruptly shifted into a long, disciplined march of legal procedure filings, sworn statements, and grand jury interviews. I spent more time in federal buildings than in my own home. I met with prosecutors, investigators, victim advocates, and my own therapist. I slept more hours at Mary's house than anywhere else, partly because I felt safer there, partly because being alone in my house still made my chest tighten. And then slowly, the legal machine that had gathered momentum from my case began moving toward trial. The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Veronica Ames, warned me early on that this would not be quick or clean. Cases built under RICO statutes required meticulous structure. Evidence had to be linked to patterns. Motives had to be proven. And defendants like Harland and Evelyn, experienced manipulators, would attempt every possible tactic to stall discredit or twist the truth. I braced myself for a long battle. It took 6 months just to prepare. 6 months of reviewing footage until my stomach knotted. 6 months of repeating the same story in depositions, answering questions from agents, attorneys, psychologists, and even experts evaluating the long-term effects of the poisoning. 6 months of seeing Julia only through brief, foggy hospital updates or messages passed along by her therapist. 6 months of waiting. And then the trials began. Harlan's trial was scheduled first, though he shocked everyone by accepting a plea deal only 2 weeks before it began. Veronica told me the news in her office, closing the door before she sat down. "He's pleading guilty," she said. "Racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and conspiracy to commit poisoning." I stared at her. He admitted it. He admitted enough, and he's agreed to testify against Evelyn and the other higher-ups. He'll provide full details of the network's operations, the processes, the hierarchy, everything. He's spent decades building this empire. Now he's dismantling it for a lighter sentence. My mouth felt dry. How light. 18 years. No parole. He would be an old man by the time he stepped outside prison walls again if he lived that long. A man who had terrorized families for more than a decade, who had stolen homes, destroyed futures, torn relationships apart, now reduced to a federal inmate number. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion. Justice was heavy, not light. Evelyn refused a deal. Her trial lasted 3 intense weeks. I attended every day not because I needed to, my testimony had already been recorded and validated, but because I wanted to see the face of the woman who had marked me as Subject 7, who had orchestrated the attempt to take my home and my sanity. She sat with perfect posture, her white hair pinned in a severe twist, her expression composed and unreadable. She never looked at me. The prosecution presented mountains of evidence, encrypted emails, financial transfers, her personal ledger of victims' instructions she'd given to recruiters like Harlan. I watched the jury members' faces shift from puzzlement to dawning horror as the full scope of the organization became clear. They saw victims from multiple states testify. They heard experts explain the psychological manipulation. They learned how the property theft worked. They listened to recordings of rituals that were part theater, part coercion, part carefully structured control. When the jury was dismissed for deliberation, everyone expected it to take days. It took less than 4 hours. Guilty on all 23 counts. When the judge read the sentence, 25 years in federal prison, something inside me loosened for the first time in nearly a year. Evelyn blinked once slowly, the only sign she understood what had just happened. I watched her hands grow still on the defense table, watched her shoulders sag almost imperceptibly. She would likely die behind bars. The empire she helped build would die with her. But justice didn't end with the leaders. The enabling professionals faced their own reckoning. Dr. Ramon stood before the court looking smaller than I expected. His shoulders rounded, his voice thin and brittle. The judge revoked his medical license permanently before sentencing him to 8 years in prison for medical fraud, falsifying test results, and participating in deliberate psychological manipulation. Hearing the doctor who had tormented Julia through false diagnoses, finally stripped of power, brought me a quiet, solemn satisfaction. The notary who authenticated the forged power of attorney received 5 years and permanent loss of her commission. She wept through the entire hearing, insisting she didn't know what she was signing, though the prosecution had overwhelming evidence that she was paid thousands of dollars for falsifying signatures. Money had made her blind, or perhaps she had never cared who she hurt. Richard Morse, the attorney who defended my parents in court and knowingly facilitated the fraud, was facing disbarment and criminal charges. His fall from professional grace felt almost Shakespearean. A man who built a career twisting laws had finally twisted one too many. It was important to me that the justice system pursue him just as aggressively as they pursued cult members, because he had never believed the doctrine. His motivation was greed, nothing more. And then there was Stephen. His trial was the hardest for me. He sat in the defendant's chair looking like a shadow of the man I grew up with. His hair had grayed rapidly. His hands trembled when he adjusted his glasses. Sometimes when he looked at me across the courtroom, there was a flicker of recognition followed by something like guilt. Other times, his eyes were empty. The prosecutor offered him a plea deal because he had provided detailed testimony about the cult's structure, the rituals, the fraud mechanisms, and the techniques Harland used to recruit vulnerable families. His cooperation had helped lock Evelyn's case beyond any doubt. Without him, the prosecution would have needed months more. But I still had a choice. I could support the deal or fight for a harsher sentence. I struggled with that decision for weeks. I met with my therapist. I talked with Margaret. I sat alone for hours reading transcripts of Stephen's admissions, comparing them to the footage of him poisoning my milk, listening to his recorded conversations about dosing me. In the end, I didn't oppose the plea. Not because I forgave him, not because the pain vanished, but because I finally understood something that had taken months to process. He was a perpetrator. Yes, but he was also deeply manipulated, vulnerable and desperate to please a charismatic leader who promised spiritual purpose. It didn't excuse him. It didn't erase what he'd done. But it complicated the picture. The judge accepted the plea deal: 3 years in prison and 2 years of supervised release contingent on full ongoing cooperation and completion of a specialized cult deprogramming program. He would serve real time but also have a chance at rehabilitation, something neither Evelyn nor Harland would ever seek or accept. When the sentence was read, Stephen looked at me for a long moment. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply met his gaze until he looked away. By the time all 20 defendants connected to the case had been sentenced, nearly a year had passed since the night Mary leaned close to me and whispered that I was not alone in my house. Now, as I sat at my desk going through paperwork for the restitution process, a courier knocked on my door. He handed me a certified envelope. The handwriting on the front made my breath catch. It was from Julia. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with her uneven handwriting. "Can you ever forgive me? I want our children to know each other." I stared at the words until they blurred, and my heart twisted in a way I hadn't expected. That was the moment I realized my fight wasn't over. I didn't respond to Julia's letter the same day it arrived. I sat with it in my lap for hours, long after the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the living room floor. I read it twice, then 3 times, feeling each word settle over me with a weight I hadn't expected. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't manipulative. It didn't try to erase the truth or ask for something she wasn't ready to explain. It was simply a question carved out of guilt and longing. Can you ever forgive me? I want our children to know each other. My first reaction was disbelief. She still saw us as family, still imagined a future that involved holiday photos and shared birthday parties. Still pictured our children hers who had not yet arrived, mine, who existed nowhere except in the hypothetical playing together. It stirred something painful in my chest, a grief that stretched all the way back into our childhood, to the young girl she once was, before the resentments, before Harland, before everything cracked open. I brought the letter to my therapist. She listened as I read it aloud, the words slipping into the soft quiet of her office. When I finished, she didn't ask what Julia wanted. She asked what I wanted, what my heart and boundaries, bruised and tired as they were, could realistically hold. "I want peace," I said slowly. "For both of us. But I can't forget what she did. I can't pretend we're stepping back into the same relationship." "That's not forgiveness," she said gently. "That's fantasy. You get to choose reality." So I wrote Julia back. I spent an entire afternoon crafting the letter, wanting it to be honest, but not cruel, firm, but not dismissive. Boundaries, I had learned, were not walls. They were definitions of where I ended and someone else began. I told her the truth, that I understood she had been manipulated through her deepest wounds, but that grief did not absolve her choices. I acknowledged her pain. I acknowledged mine. And then I drew the line: I need distance. I wish you well, but I can't pretend nothing happened. Maybe someday things will change. Right now, I need space to live my life without fear. That was the quietest revenge I ever enacted, refusing to give the cult or the pain they caused the power to dictate my relationships. Refusing to fall back into familiarity because it was easier than honoring my own healing. My home came next. The legal confirmation that the forged property transfer was void arrived on a cool morning in early summer. I held the document in my hands and felt a wave of relief crash over me so powerfully it nearly buckled my knees. My house, the house my mother left me. The house I once feared was haunted by the living rather than the dead was mine again. I decided not to live in a space still defined by the shadows of what had happened, so I repainted every room, choosing colors that felt warm and grounding. The living room became honey gold, the hallway a soft, creamy taupe. The bedroom I once feared became a deep, soothing green. Watching the paint roller glide across the walls felt like reclaiming oxygen after months of suffocating. I replaced the carpet in the bedroom entirely. I watched workers rip it up, exposing the floorboards beneath. The air smelled like dust and wood, and something clean, not incense, not ash, not the memory of rituals performed in secret. I installed a new security system with cameras in strategic places. The first night the system beeped as it armed, I nearly cried, not out of fear, but out of relief. The house was finally under my control, not theirs. But the most healing thing I did was start a garden. It began with a few herbs, basil, thyme, rosemary, but quickly grew into something bigger. Mary came over almost every afternoon, teaching me how to plant perennials, how to prune roses, how to listen to soil the way she once listened to her daughter. Together we created a memorial garden for Sarah, a small patch of earth bursting with lavender and wildflowers. A place where grief could grow into something gentle instead of something sharp. Sometimes we sat together in silence on the wooden bench we installed under the magnolia tree. Sometimes Mary told stories about Sarah, the way she loved to paint, the way she laughed, the way she struggled long before the cult ever found her. Hearing those stories was like stitching a wound neither of us had realized was still open. As my home came back to life, so did I. 6 months after the trials, I began speaking publicly about what had happened to me. Not the sensational parts, though the media had already consumed those, but the practical truth that predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like spiritual guides. Sometimes like caring relatives. Sometimes like healers. I spoke at senior centers first, at community meetings, then at conferences for counselors and social workers. I learned there were so many people, too many who had brushed against the edges of the same kind of manipulation, but never had the words to describe it. They lined up after my talks, sharing fragments of their stories, some trembling with the fear they had never voiced aloud. I didn't have answers for all of them, but I had tools, insight, warning signs. And sometimes that was enough to save them before the spiral began. It became my purpose, turning my trauma into a map someone else could escape with. Life grew quieter after that, softer, full of moments that felt normal in a way I hadn't experienced for nearly 2 years. I cooked more. I volunteered more. I spent evenings sitting on my porch with Mary, sipping tea, watching the sky darken. One afternoon, early in spring, sunlight warmed my shoulders as I knelt in the garden planting new marigolds. Mary stepped outside with 2 glasses of lemonade, her steps slower but steady. We settled on the porch, breathing in the scent of damp soil and fresh blossoms. My phone buzzed. I reached for it absent-mindedly, and froze. A photo filled the screen, a newborn baby wrapped in a pink blanket, eyes shut. Peacefully, tiny fingers curled into delicate fists. The caption underneath read, "Sarah Rose, born today, healthy. Thank you for helping me see the truth. We're okay." I handed the phone to Mary. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, her eyes filling instantly. "She named her Sarah," she whispered. I nodded, feeling a tangle of emotions, sorrow, hope, forgiveness in its earliest form. Not acceptance, not reunion, but the quiet acknowledgement that healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like a child receiving a name that carries both remembrance and promise. I typed back, "She's beautiful. I hope she grows up strong." Then I set my phone aside and returned to my garden, digging my fingers into the earth, feeling its cool steadiness anchor me. This was my life now, a life I'd fought for, a life I chose every day. Not perfect, not simple, but mine. And I wasn't looking back anymore. That year, the Restoration Circle was completely dismantled by federal authorities. Over 200 victims received restitution totaling $8.4 million in recovered assets. Claire Matthews became a certified victim advocate and has helped 34 families recognize and escape similar exploitation. Julia completed a 2-year cult recovery program and maintains limited contact with Claire. Stephen was released after serving 22 months and now works in a cult awareness nonprofit. Lorna lives quietly in an assisted living facility and has not attempted contact with Claire. Mary and Claire remain neighbors and closest friends. The house on Maple Street stands as proof that sometimes you have to fight your own family to save yourself, and there's no shame in that. When I look back on everything that happened, I still feel a kind of disbelief that my own family, the people I trusted most, became the doorway through which strangers tried to take my home, my future, and even my mind. But I also see the strength I didn't know I had. I see the neighbor who chose courage over silence. I see the legal team who fought beside me. I see the parts of myself that survived when everything around me was designed to break me. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, room by room, choice by choice. It wasn't quick and it wasn't simple, but it was mine. Healing, I learned, isn't an ending. It's a beginning shaped by every moment you decide you deserve safety, truth, and peace. And maybe that's what I want you to take from my story most of all, that even when betrayal comes from the places we least expect, even when the people who should protect us become the ones who harm us, we still have the power to rebuild. We still have the right to draw boundaries, to speak our truth, to refuse to carry guilt that does not belong to us. My life now is quiet. Not empty quiet in the way a home feels quiet when it's finally safe again. Quiet in the way a garden grows when no one is trying to poison the roots. Quiet in the way a heart settles once it realizes the danger has passed. I tend my plants. I sip tea with Mary in the afternoons. I open the windows and let the sunlight in without glancing over my shoulder. I answer messages from people who heard my story and saw themselves in it. I remind them that fear does not make them weak, and speaking up does not make them dramatic. It makes them survivors. And now, as this chapter closes, I want to speak directly to you. Stories like mine are not just entertainment. They are warnings. They are reminders. They are invitations to pay attention to the subtle shifts around you, to trust your intuition when something feels wrong, and to believe yourself even when others try to twist your reality. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it opened your eyes to dangers that often hide behind familiar faces, then I want to ask you to take one simple step: subscribe to this channel. When you subscribe, you help this community grow. You help us spread more stories that protect, empower, and shed light on the darker corners of human behavior. And I truly want to hear from you. Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Have you ever sensed something was wrong before you had evidence? Have you ever dealt with manipulation or betrayal from someone you trusted? Or do you simply want to share what part of this journey struck you the most? Your experiences, your thoughts, your reflections, they matter. Leave a comment below. Tell your story. Ask your questions. Or just let me know you're out there listening. And if you want more stories filled with twists, revelations, justice, and survival, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And above all, thank you for caring about stories that remind us we're not alone.